Hey guys, tonight we're stepping past 5 centuries of European fantasy paintings, bad historical novels, and one very confident Ingres canvas to find out what the Ottoman Imperial Harem at Topkapı Palace actually was, which was less a den of erotic luxury and more a self-contained city inside a palace, running on hierarchy, politics, and an amount of paperwork that would make a modern HR department weep. Not the intertwined naked women in a round pool, not the gauzy curtains and the obedient captives. A 5,000 square metre compound with over 400 rooms, a mosque, a hospital, a treasury, and its own coffee attendants. If you're new here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy drifting off to mildly disturbing, deeply factual history. A huge thank you to one of you for suggesting this one. I hope you're comfortable, because we are going in. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always somehow 2 inches the morning somewhere, which tonight feels historically appropriate. Dim the lights, turn on a fan, get settled, and maybe don't assume the room you're sleeping in is the room you'll be sleeping in tomorrow. Have you ever wondered what 400 women inside a single palace complex actually sounds like at 6 in the morning? How did a girl acquired at age 10 from the Caucasus end up conducting diplomatic correspondence with Queen Elizabeth I of England? What does your rank get you specifically in candles? Did the word harem ever mean what Europeans decided it meant, or did it mean something else entirely and everyone just ignored that? Could you survive 22 years locked in a suite with no governance education, no outside contact, and no explanation of when or whether it ends? What happens when the most politically powerful woman in the empire gets strangled with a curtain cord by someone who just got promoted? And seriously, who was managing the palace's 50,000 kilograms of annual sugar? Congratulations! You've just woken up inside Topkapı Palace, Istanbul, sometime around 1650. The tiles on the wall are cobalt blue and tomato red, the fountain in the corridor is already running, and someone is calling the morning prayer. You don't know your rank yet. Good luck. You arrive without a name anyone here will use. The women who received you at the gate spoke in a language you don't understand, moved you through a series of rooms with practiced efficiency, and assigned you a number before they assigned you anything else. You are a carrier now, a slave recruit, and the entire institutional machinery of the Topkapı Harem has just begun processing you the way a customs office processes a shipment. Your age has been assessed. Your health has been checked. Your origins have been noted in a register. You came from the Caucasus, most likely. Circassian. You were purchased at the Evret Pazari, the women's market, which operated openly near the Grand Bazaar and was a standard stop on the Venetian diplomatic observation circuit, which is basically a trade show that foreign dignitaries attended, took careful notes on, and then wrote lengthy reports about back home. Your purchase price was somewhere between 40 and 60 gold sultani, several years of wages for an Istanbul craftsman. The market had opinions about your origins, your age, your teeth. You are, by palace classification, Assami, inexperienced, not a rank so much as the absence of one. The word lands flatly, like a form that says status, pending, and means it. Imagine being told your status is pending, and discovering that pending is also the name of an entire dormitory. You are between 8 and 14 years old, and nobody here is particularly interested in where you were before this, because before this doesn't have administrative relevance. The dormitory room holds 8 women, possibly 10. You'll know by tonight. The ceiling above your assigned sleeping space is Iznik tilework, cobalt blue, tomato red, tulips and carnations climbing a field of white, considered among the finest ceramics produced anywhere in the world in the 16th century. You are sleeping 6 to a room directly beneath it. The tile doesn't comment on this arrangement. It's been here longer than anyone in the building, and it'll be here longer than anyone in the building, and it has developed a kind of institutional serenity about the whole situation. You look up at it from your mat. It looks back with the bored patience of something that has watched 50 frightened girls do exactly the same thing. A kalfa whose braids are always coming loose sets a bundle of folded cotton at the foot of your mat. She says a word in Ottoman Turkish you don't catch. She's gone before you've decided whether to nod. You'll learn the word later, or you won't. Let's talk about what happens next, because what happens next is not what European painters assumed happened next. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres painted his version in 1862, a pool of intertwined naked women in a round room, which is the harem the way Epcot is France. Have you ever wondered what the actual curriculum looked like? What actually happens is school, years of it. Ottoman Turkish, which you don't speak yet, the Quran, Islamic prayer, classical music, embroidery, calligraphy, the precise, load-bearing protocols of court etiquette, which have consequences attached to every mistake. It's basically a Juilliard Conservatory track spliced with an Army Ranger selection course, except the graduation ceremony is a private audience and nobody gets a signing bonus. The hierarchy above you is specific and fully documented. Cariyes at the bottom, then guzde, noticed, then ikbal, favoured, then haseki, the Sultan's recognised consort. At the top, the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, whose annual income could reach 3,000 gold sultani, and whose suite features a private bath, a formal audience room, and Iznik tilework that does not share walls with 9 other people. Each rank carries its own allowances, named room assignments, silver axis stipends, precise fabric quotas, candle rations, and a fixed number of personal attendants. It's basically an airline boarding group system, except the gate agent is every woman in the building, and there is no alternate flight. You won't see most of this building for a long time. The harem compound by the 17th century contains over 400 rooms, multiple courtyards, a mosque, a hospital ward, and its own treasury. 5,000 square meters of stone corridors and tiled chambers, heated by underfloor furnaces that servants maintain in the basement. In January, the corridors carry 3 smells simultaneously: burning wood, olive oil soap, and the heavy floral perfume women apply to their hair. You'll learn to identify people by that 3rd smell before you learn their names. For now, though, you have a dormitory assignment, a language you can't speak, and a register entry that describes you in administrative terms you also can't read. Take a breath. The institution is patient. It's been doing this for a long time. You learn the ranks the way you'd learn traffic laws in a foreign country, fast, by proximity to consequences. There's the Valide Sultan at the top, who is the Sultan's mother and technically outranks everyone in this building, including most of the men outside it. Below her are the haseki, who are the Sultan's recognised favourites and have apartments that come with their own staff. Below them are the ikbal, and below them the guzde, and below the guzde are the kalfas who run daily operations, and below all of them is you. The ranks aren't informal. Each one comes with a specific room assignment, a silver axe allowance paid on a fixed schedule, a fabric quota measured in bolts, a candle ration counted by the week, and a designated number of personal attendants. It's basically a Marriott Bonvoy tier system, except the points are candles and the upgrade is a private bath. The Valide Sultan's suite has Iznik tile revetments, cobalt blue and tomato red, tulips and cypress trees, considered among the finest ceramics in the world, and a formal audience room where petitioners come to her. You have 6 roommates and a shared lamp. The kalfas are the ones you'll deal with daily. They're senior women who've worked their way up through years of demonstrated competence, and they run the dormitory schedules, the training rotations, the kitchen assignments, and approximately every other logistical function that keeps 400 women from descending into administrative chaos. Picture a middle manager with the institutional memory of an elephant and a keyring that never leaves her waist. They know where everything is. They know who owes what to whom. They know which ikbal is currently in the Valide Sultan's favour and which one said something unfortunate last Tuesday. You don't know any of this yet. They do. A senior kalfa passes you carrying a roll of silk across both forearms the way you'd carry a sleeping child. She does not acknowledge you. An hour later she passes again, empty-handed, and inclines her head half a degree. The silk has been delivered. The acknowledgement is the receipt. Rank here moves slowly and mostly upward, with one significant exception. A carrier who catches the Sultan's attention becomes a gozd, literally, one who is noticed. A gozde who is summoned to his chamber becomes an ikbal. An ikbal who produces a living son becomes a haseki, at which point her material circumstances change so dramatically it's essentially a different job. The Valide Sultan's annual income reached 3,000 gold sultani, roughly what a provincial governor earned, which is a little like finding out the HR director makes more than the regional VP, except the HR director also controls your housing, your wardrobe budget, and whether your letters leave the building. Have you ever tried to keep track of a candle budget when you're not actually sure what your budget is? The kalfas hand you your candle ration without looking up. That's the whole relationship, transmitted in one gesture. You count the candles yourself. You find them one short on a Tuesday and you don't mention it, because mentioning it would confirm you counted, and counting is what someone new does. You place the candles in the box under your bed. The box was here before you were. It will be here when you're not. The fabric quota is more complicated than it sounds. Higher ranks receive silk. You receive cotton. The difference is visible from across a courtyard, which is the point. Clothing here isn't personal expression. It's a public-facing rank indicator, which is basically a TSA pre-check lane marker you wear on your body, except the line never ends and the gate agent is every woman in the room. The Valide Sultan's women wear specific colours that signal their proximity to power. You do not wear those colours. You learn this before someone has to tell you. You don't speak Ottoman Turkish when you arrive, and that's everyone's first problem, including yours. The language isn't taught as a courtesy. It's the entrance fee to every conversation that matters in this building, and the conversations that matter are the ones that determine whether you get a better room, a better posting, or any visibility at all. Your instructor is a Kalfa who speaks with the particular patience of someone who has explained the same conjugation to 100 different frightened girls and expects to explain it 100 more times. The curriculum doesn't stop at Turkish. You're also expected to learn Quranic recitation, Islamic prayer in the correct sequence, classical music on an instrument you may not have touched before, embroidery, calligraphy, and the precise weight of silence required when a senior woman enters the room. This takes years. It's basically the McKinsey analyst onboarding program, except the exit opportunity, if you're very good and very lucky, is becoming the most powerful woman in an empire. Most people don't make it to the exit opportunity. You enter classified as a semi, inexperienced. The word is generous. It means no one has any particular expectations of you yet, which sounds freeing until you understand that expectations are the only currency with any purchasing power in here. A girl who progresses quickly through her lessons earns attention from her Kalfa. Attention from a Kalfa earns visibility. Visibility earns assignment. Assignment earns rank. The chain is long, and it starts with whether you can produce the correct vowel sounds in Ottoman Turkish before the lesson ends. Have you ever tried to hold a pen that appears to actively dislike you? The calligraphy is harder than it looks. The reed pen doesn't cooperate. It has the disposition of a very old cat, technically capable of doing what you want, but philosophically opposed to it. You practice the same letter until the page is full of identical failures, and then you practice it again. No one is unkind about this. The Kalfas aren't unkind about much, which is actually more unsettling than if they were. Unkind would at least give you something to push back on. Music lessons happen in one of the interior rooms, and the sound carries. Quran recitation carries further. The harem's sound landscape on any given morning is a layered thing. Someone practicing Oud in one room, someone else reciting Al-Fatiha in the next, water moving through the decorative channels in the courtyard, and somewhere below that, the low thud of the furnaces that keep the floors warm. It's ambient in the way that a very busy airport is ambient. You stop hearing it individually. It becomes the sound of the place. A younger carrier 2 mats over has been practicing the same opening vowel for 3 days. The Kalfa corrects her with a single syllable and walks on. The girl tries again. Better. The Kalfa does not come back. The confirmation you understand now is her absence. Embroidery is the one lesson where rank doesn't visibly matter. Everyone's hands look the same, bent over a frame. New girls, advanced girls, Kalfas doing their own work in the corner. The stitches expected of you grow more complex as you advance, but the posture is identical across the room. This is, as far as anyone can tell, the only equalizer in the building. Don't get attached to it. You finish a line of script. The Kalfa walks past, glances at the page, and doesn't stop. That's your grade for the afternoon. You dip the pen again. The ink is darker than it was yesterday. Someone has mixed a new batch in the corner, and the room smells faintly of gall and soot. You start the next line. There are 11 more before the evening prayer, and you can already feel which fingers will refuse to cooperate by the 6th. You have a schedule now. It starts before sunrise with Quran recitation and ends well after dark with embroidery practice that your fingers haven't yet learned to do without pain. In between there is Ottoman calligraphy, classical music instruction on the UD or Kanun, court etiquette, so elaborate it has its own vocabulary, and Islamic prayer at 5 fixed intervals that the day is organized around. Someone hands you the schedule on a folded sheet of paper. You cannot yet read it. The prayer schedule doesn't bend. Fajr arrives before dawn while the corridors are still cold and the stone floors are at their most enthusiastic about reminding you they're stone. You wash, you pray, you return to the dormitory where 5 to 9 other women are at various stages of the same process. The room smells like sleep and olive oil soap and the faint residue of whoever burned the candle too low the night before. Then the kalfas begin their rounds, and the day activates. Music instruction happens in a dedicated room, which is more than most conservatories can say. The UD has 11 strings and doesn't forgive imprecision, and neither does the kalfa standing at the back of the room keeping count. You're learning to play an instrument you may have never touched before arriving here, in a language you're still assembling, on a schedule you didn't choose. This is basically a Juilliard audition, except you're already enrolled and leaving isn't an option. Calligraphy runs separately. The reed pen and the ink and the paper all have opinions, and none of those opinions align with your current skill level. The script is Ottoman, looping, layered, requiring a specific angle of the wrist that your hand hasn't memorized yet. The kalfas don't rush this. They've seen every version of it before. Your particular struggle with the kaf is not interesting to them. It is, however, noted. Court etiquette gets its own block of the afternoon, which tells you everything about its importance. Picture a test where you don't know the questions, the answers, or when the grading happens, except the grading happens every single moment you're in a room with anyone. How you enter a room, how you leave it, the precise depth of a bow in front of a ranking woman, and the different precise depth in front of a woman who outranks her, where your eyes go and when. What you don't say, which covers considerably more ground than what you do. The whole system runs like an unwritten DMV manual, except the test is continuous, the examiner is always watching, and failing means staying invisible indefinitely. A kalfa demonstrates the bow for the senior haseki. She holds the pose longer than necessary. Then she rises, turns to the room of new girls, and says nothing. The demonstration was the whole lesson. 3 girls in the back row do not understand yet that it was also the exam. Embroidery closes the day. Your fingers hurt. They hurt in the specific way of someone who has been asked to perform fine motor tasks for hours while exhausted, which is its own genre of pain. The silk threads come in colours that don't exist in the world you came from. Not at this density, not at this cost. You're learning to produce something beautiful under conditions that aren't. The candle ration for your dormitory level doesn't quite cover the light you'd need, so the last hour runs on what's available. Which, yes, is a polite way of saying you're doing delicate needlework in the dark. The kalfa signals the end of the day with a single clap. You stand, your back has opinions, the needle goes back into its case. The silk panel is folded along lines someone else drew for you, and the lamp is pinched out between 2 fingers that don't flinch anymore. You lie down. The candle box is still where you left it. You have a rank, and the rank comes with a number. A specific quantity of silver axi deposited into your account each month, a fixed number of candles allotted per week, and a fabric quota for your clothing measured in arshin that doesn't adjust upward unless your rank does. The women above you have more candles. The women above them have more fabric. The Valide Sultan's annual income reaches 3,000 gold sultani, roughly what a provincial governor earns managing an entire region of the empire. You are not yet managing a region of the empire. The full hierarchy runs from the bottom like this. Cariyes, which is you if you've just arrived. Then cariyes, still you, but slightly more organized. Then Guzde, meaning the Sultan has noticed your existence. Then ikbal, meaning he's acted on that notice. Then haseki, his formally recognized consort. And at the absolute top, the Valide Sultan, who runs the institution, receives petitioners in a formal audience room and has Iznik tile revetments in her private bath. It's basically a LinkedIn.org chart, except every promotion is permanent, undocumented, and decided by one person who may or may not be paying attention this week. Now let's talk about the candles. Because yes, in 1650, your career depended on wax. The material differences between ranks aren't symbolic. They're itemized. A Gozde receives a named room instead of a dormitory bunk shared with 7 other women. An Iqbal gets more candles and a personal attendant. A haseki gets a suite, a separate bath, silver vessels for her coffee service, and a salary that the palace treasury writes down in its actual ledgers. The candles are not a metaphor. The candles are candles. Running out before the weekends is your problem. 4 candles a week, let's say. And yes, you will be counting. The candle ration is why you finish embroidery on a Tuesday and not a Thursday. The candle ration is why the ikbal 2 corridors over can read after evening prayer and you cannot. The candle ration is why an extra wick, pressed into your hand without comment, is the closest thing to a raise you've been offered this season. Lower-ranking women sleep 6 to 10 to a chamber. This is not a temporary inconvenience, it's the posted rate for that tier of the institution. The rooms aren't unpleasant, particularly by the standards of 16th century Istanbul. The floors are heated by a hypercoarse system fed by wood-burning furnaces in the basement, which is basically Nest smart heating, except the thermostat is a human being working underground who can't be reached via app. In winter, the corridors smell like burning wood and heavy floral perfume applied generously to offset the fact that you are living in a stone building in January with several hundred other people. Your fabric allocation matters more than it probably sounds. Have you ever wondered what it's like to wear your salary band on the outside of your body? Clothing in the harem isn't personal expression, it's legible rank data. The type of silk, the colour, the embroidery complexity, the number of garments allotted per season, all of it corresponds directly to where you sit in the hierarchy. A senior Kalfa can read your allocation at a glance, the way a maitre d' at a 3-Michelin-star restaurant reads a reservation and knows exactly how much attention you're going to get. You get the attention appropriate to your fabric quota. The fabric quota doesn't negotiate. Advancement is real, and it happens. A carrier who masters Ottoman Turkish quickly, plays the kanun with noticeable skill, and conducts herself with precision during formal ceremonies can move upward through the ranks inside of a decade. The Kalfas who supervised your training in Segment 4 were once exactly where you are now. Some of them leveraged their positions into genuine institutional authority, managing younger women, controlling access to senior figures, functioning as the actual administrative layer of a 5,000 square meter compound housing up to 600 people. The org chart has rungs. The rungs are reachable. Someone new arrives at the gate on a Thursday. You hear the Kalfas moving in the corridor before you see anything. By that evening, a bed in the chamber, 3 doors down, has been reassigned, 2 garments have been reissued to a different allocation number, and a woman who slept there last week is now sleeping closer to the window. Nobody announces any of this. The candle ration arrives Friday the way it always does. The fabric bolt is a different colour than the last one. You sleep in a room with between 5 and 9 other women, which isn't a problem the palace presents as a problem. The room assignment is just what your rank produces. Lower-ranking cariyes share chambers. The number of bodies per room decreases as you climb, until somewhere above you, women have their own apartment with their own attendants and space to simply exist without narrating every moment to an audience. The dormitory has its own social geometry, who gets which bed, who controls which corner, who has been there longest, and intends to make you aware of it. The beds are not the worst part. The worst part is the sound. Running water from the fountain channels moves through the complex constantly, which is either soothing or maddening depending on how long you've been here, and the answer shifts around month 4. Music lessons bleed through from the next corridor. Someone is reciting Quran. Someone else is drilling embroidery stitches in the lamplight, which produces no sound at all but radiates a very specific kind of pointed industry that feels loud. Above you, the Valide Sultan's suite has Iznik tiles in cobalt blue and tomato red, tulips, carnations, cypress trees, covering the walls from floor to ceiling in patterns so precise that art historians in the 21st century still argue about them. You haven't seen them. That suite isn't on your itinerary. Your walls are plaster. In winter, the stone corridors smell like burning wood and the floral perfume women apply to their hair and clothing, layered together in a combination that's technically pleasant and practically inescapable. The building runs on a hypercourse system, underfloor heating fed by wood furnaces in the basement, which is basically an Airbnb superhost listing, where the host personally shovels coal under the floor and cannot be contacted via the app. The floors stay warm. The upper walls do not. You sleep closer to the centre of the room in January, twice a month, roughly. There's the hammam. Picture this: wet tile, sloped floors, and the bath floors having strong opinions about gravity. You wear wooden patterns, takunya, on your feet because the bath floors are wet and sloped and have no interest in keeping you upright. The steam carries olive oil, soap, and ardour, a depilatory paste made from sugar, lemon juice, and heat. Applied and removed in a process the palace considers routine grooming and your nervous system considers an event. The sound is clatter and steam and water. For an hour, rank mostly disappears. Then you put the patterns back on and it reappears. The dormitory has a hierarchy inside the hierarchy, which is basically a succession season, but the budget is candles and the prize is a slightly better mattress. The woman who arrived 3 years before you has opinions about the window. She's expressed them. You've noted them. Nobody's said anything directly, because nothing in this building gets said directly if it can be managed through implication and prolonged eye contact instead. 2 cariyes on the far side of the room are folding the same quilt, one at each end. Neither speaks. They step toward each other, bring the corners together, step apart. Again, the younger one is watching the older one's wrists. That's how the fold is being taught. Nobody has called it a lesson. Food arrives by rank. An elaborate court meal, saffron and pistachio rice, lamb with dried fruit, cheese burek, rosewater sweets with mastic, exists somewhere in the building, served at the top of the hierarchy with the kind of ceremony that requires specialized attendance. Coffee has its own staff, cariyes, who manage the harem's coffee service with a seriousness that the modern Starbucks district manager would recognize and respect. What reaches your table is a simpler version of what reaches theirs. The saffron is the same. The portion is not. You are aware, at all times, of the exact number of people in the room. Not because you count, because your body counts for you. You go to the hammam when your time slot arrives, not before, not when you feel like it, and not privately. There's a schedule organized by rank, which means the senior women get the first water and the full heat and the attendance with the best technique. The wooden patterns, the takunya, clatter on wet tile floors and announce your arrival to everyone already there, which means the bath is also a social space where hierarchies are confirmed and information moves and your status is visible in exactly who defers to whom. Have you ever wondered what it sounds like when a few dozen women share a steam room on a fixed hierarchy schedule? Louder than you'd expect, warmer than you'd want. The hammam itself is warm and loud in specific ways. Running water echoes off marble. Steam carries the smell of olive oil, soap and ardour, the depilatory paste made from sugar, lemon juice and heat, applied every 2 to 4 weeks whether you've requested it or not. The ardour has a schedule too. The ardour doesn't ask. Let's talk about the attendants, because the attendants are the point. A senior woman, an ikbal, a haseki, doesn't pour her own water. She has a kalfa assigned to manage her bath, which means the bath is also a performance of status, witnessed by everyone in the room, which in the 16th century Ottoman Harem is basically everyone who matters. The junior cariyes scrub their own backs. The seniority gradient is legible from across the steam. The bath schedule is also when information circulates. Nobody's writing anything down. There's no group chat, but 400 to 600 women live within a 5,000 square meter complex, and the hammam is one of the few places where ranks briefly share space, which makes it the closest thing the harem has to a town square, warmer than most, and with better soap. Word about a new arrival, a demotion, a pregnancy, a change in the sultan's attention. It moves through the steam and settles before the water cools. A cariyes crosses the outer corridor with 2 empty copper cups on a tray. She's just come from the senior women's chamber. She does not look at the junior cariyes stepping out of their patterns. You read her posture anyway. The senior haseki is upset about something. Nobody will say so for another day and a half. The Iznik tiles on the hammam walls are not incidental. Cobalt blue and tomato red, tulips and carnations and cypress trees, glazed so precisely they still look wet. Go ahead, press a wet palm against one. It's colder than the air, and the imprint evaporates before you've finished drying your hair. You're clean, you're surrounded by extraordinary beauty, and you've just watched 4 other women be deferred to before anyone looked in your direction. 3 things at once. The timing of your bath slot is also, technically, information. First slot means you matter. Last slot means you're new, or you've fallen, or you were never particularly high to begin with. A woman who arrived last month and a woman who's held a rank for 6 years stand in the same steam, and the only thing distinguishing them is who moves out of whose way first. The takunya clatter when you walk in. Everyone hears it. Nobody looks up immediately, which is its own kind of answer. By the time you're done, dried, redressed, hair oiled and pinned, you know more than you did an hour ago. Not because anyone told you anything directly. A junior Kalfa who normally greets you by name walked past twice without looking. An ikbal from the east dormitory took her towel from the attendant without the usual small inclination of the head. You pin the last bit of hair, pick up the takunya, and step out into the corridor. You can ask for a better rank. The mechanism for asking is formal, slow, and runs upward through every tier between you and the person capable of granting it. You don't address the Valide Sultan directly. You tell a Kalfa who tells a senior Kalfa who, if the matter is considered worth passing on, tells the appropriate intermediary who may eventually raise it at the right moment. You practice the opening sentence under your breath on the way to the afternoon embroidery circle. You cross it out twice. The third version is the one you use. The candles matter more than you'd think. At your current rank, you receive enough to see by. At the next rank, you receive enough to read by. The gap between those two quantities is narrower than it sounds and larger than it looks. Advancement doesn't have an application form. It has witnesses. Have you ever wondered what a promotion process looks like when there's no HR department, no posted criteria, and no feedback form? This is it. The right Kalfa needs to have seen you perform competently in a high-visibility moment. The right intermediary needs to have heard your name in a favorable context, unprompted, from someone whose opinion carries weight. It's less like a job review and more like the Senate confirmation process, except the senators are 12 women in a stone corridor who've known each other for a decade and have deeply formed opinions about your posture during prayer. You're not passive in this. You manage your visibility. You volunteer for tasks that place you in rooms where decisions happen. You perform your embroidery where it can be seen and your Quran recitation where it can be heard. You arrive to coffee service early enough to be useful, but not so early that it looks effortful. The cariyes, the specialized coffee attendants, have their own internal ranking, and they notice who arrives composed and who arrives rattled. Coffee service is an audition. Most people don't know it's an audition. You only get to learn that lesson once. The Kalfas watch all of this, which is their job. A senior Kalfa who's been in the compound for 15 years has developed a surveillance capacity that makes modern Ring doorbell systems look inattentive. She knows which women speak to each other before dawn, which ones cry after music lessons, which ones have been eating less than their ration. She doesn't volunteer this information freely, she files it. On the morning you ask, a senior Kalfa is standing at the long window watching a sparrow on the courtyard rim. She does not turn when you speak. She lets your sentence finish. She inclines her head 1/8 of a degree. You curtsy to her back and walk out. That was the petition. If you get the timing wrong on the request, too soon, after a minor visible failure, or during a period when the Valide Sultan's attention is occupied with something that actually matters to an empire, the request doesn't get refused. It just doesn't move. It sits at whatever tier it reached and stops, and nobody tells you where it stopped or why. You wait. You regroup. You try again in a season when the corridor feels different. A woman 2 dormitories over framed her request correctly in autumn and was moved to a single room by winter. She doesn't eat with the old chamber anymore. You pass her once in the corridor near the kitchen. She nods. It takes roughly half a second. You nod back in the same half a second. You keep walking. You drink your coffee when your rank says you drink it, served in the manner your position specifies, by the attendant your level permits. The women responsible for this, the cariyes, manage their own distinct operation inside the harem's larger one, and the coffee they serve carries social information alongside the caffeine. Who receives it first? Who gets it in their private apartment versus the common space? What tray it arrives on? Which attendant carries it? All of it means something. You don't control any of these variables. You watch your cup arrive and you read what it says about you today. Let's talk about the coffee. It's not a drink. It's a daily performance review delivered in a tulip-shaped cup. Picture this. A drink so coded with information that the cup itself is basically a daily horoscope printed in silver and copper. The cariyes aren't casual volunteers rotating through kitchen duty. They're specialists, dedicated. The coffee service is their assignment, and they've been trained in it with the same thoroughness applied to music and calligraphy. The Valide Sultan's coffee arrives first, in its own vessel, in her apartment, without her asking. Yours arrives later. You note the weight of the zarf in your palm. You note the colour of the attendant's head wrap. You note, without looking up, that today's attendant is not the one who came yesterday. The coffee itself is prepared thick and unfiltered. Turkish coffee, which is basically the original espresso except nobody's charging $9 for it, And the cup doesn't have your name misspelled on the side. You don't sweeten it yourself. That detail has already been managed for you. At the higher ranks, your preference is known and maintained without discussion. At the lower ranks, you receive what's appropriate for your level. The coffee doesn't ask your opinion. The coffee has already decided. The tray matters. It's not decorative indifference. The material it's made from, the covering placed over the cup, whether a second cup arrives, these details accumulate into a precise statement about where you stand at this specific moment, which may not be where you stood last week if something has shifted in the room. The cariyes know which way the room is tilting before the room does. Their service reflects it. You find out through your tray. The tray is why a Kalfa 2 doors down changed how she greets you last Wednesday. The tray is why the ikbal across the courtyard no longer sends her attendant past your window. The tray is why you know, before anyone has told you, that a reassignment is being drafted in a room you have never entered. This is where it gets complicated, because the coffee circuit crosses every social layer of the compound twice daily. The cariyes move through spaces most women don't enter, carry information between floors without technically delivering messages, and notice who is present, who is absent, and who asked for a second cup. The coffee service is basically the harem's internal Reuters wire. It just smells better and doesn't have a loading cursor. A senior cariyes stops at your doorway on the way back from the Valide Sultan's anteroom. She adjusts the cloth on her empty tray. She does not enter. She takes 4 seconds to arrange what is already arranged, and then she is gone. The 4 seconds were the message. By the 17th century, a compound housing 400 to 600 women, and running its own coffee operation at scale, is purchasing beans through the palace provisioning system in quantities that would embarrass a regional Starbucks franchise. You see the sacks once, in the corridor outside the storerooms, being moved on a handcart that squeaks on the third wheel. The attendant pushing the cart doesn't look at you. She's counting under her breath in Ottoman Turkish. She reaches 60 by the time she passes. Meanwhile, the Valide Sultan sits in her apartment, Iznik tiles running floor to ceiling in cobalt and tomato red, her coffee already there, her preference already known, the cariyes who delivered it already gone. She doesn't think about the tray. She doesn't have to. That's the point. The tray arriving exactly as expected is the whole message, and it arrives every single day without fail, which is either deeply reassuring or deeply something else, depending entirely on how you got to that room. You wear what your rank permits. The fabric quota you receive is calibrated to place you correctly in the visual hierarchy, not too fine, not so rough as to suggest neglect, exactly what a woman at your level is supposed to look like. Senior women wear silk and furs in winter. The haseki have access to embroidery that takes months to produce. You have what your allotment provides. Jewelry arrives later, if it arrives at all, and its weight announces your position without requiring a single word from you. The fabric allocation isn't a suggestion, it's a ledger entry. The palace treasury records specify the grade of cloth, the quantity in cubits, and the timing of each distribution by rank, which is basically an Apple Store Genius Bar reservation system, except the wristband telling the staff how serious to take you is the kaftan you're wearing, and the staff is every woman in the room. A carrier at the bottom of the hierarchy receives undyed cotton or rough linen. A kalfa above her gets better cut and a permitted colour range. By the time you reach ikbal, the fabric has started to do something architecturally ambitious. Have you ever worn an outfit that told everyone in the room exactly how much you were making? That's Tuesday. The kaftan itself is the status document. Fur trim signals winter rank, sable for the highest women, squirrel for those below. The embroidery patterns aren't decorative choices. They're assigned categories. Gold thread appears at certain levels and not at others. The rules aren't written on the wall. They don't need to be. Every woman who has spent more than 6 months inside the compound can read another woman's clothing the way you'd read a name tag, except the name tag also specifies salary band, current favour, and recent political trajectory. A kalfa sets a folded square of cotton on the chest at the foot of your mat. She does not unfold it. She does not announce what it is. The colour is visible at the corner, the same undyed cream it was last season. Your allocation has not changed. The fold said so. Jewellery is more complicated. It doesn't arrive on a schedule. A jewelled hairpin or a gold bracelet reaches you when someone above you decides it should, which means jewellery is less an entitlement and more a communication. A gift from the Valide Sultan's hand carries a meaning the object itself doesn't need to explain. A conspicuous absence of jewelry after you had some carries a different meaning. Your wrist knows things your face is not allowed to show. The ceremonial occasions are where the visual grammar gets loudest. A formal audience, a royal birth celebration, a circumcision feast. These are the moments when every rank dresses to its absolute limit. The room becomes a legible chart. You can tell at a glance who has risen, who has held steady, and who is wearing last season's allocation with the careful posture of someone who'd prefer you not to notice. It's less like getting dressed and more like filing a quarterly report in textile form. The hammam complicates the hierarchy exactly once. In the bathhouse, stripped of fabric rank and jewelry weight, the visual system temporarily short-circuits. For the duration of the bath, the only things left are the wooden patterns clattering on wet stone, the smell of olive oil soap and ardour rising in the steam, and the unremarkable fact of bodies at roughly similar temperatures. Then you dry off. You put the kaftan back on. The hierarchy reassembles itself from the fabric outward, which takes considerably less time than it took to remove it. You eat what your rank earns you. The meals distributed from the main kitchen follow a hierarchy that begins with the Sultan, passes through the Valide Sultan, and reaches you at a point in the sequence that reflects exactly how valuable the institution currently considers you to be. An elaborate court meal for those above you includes saffron and pistachio rice pilaf, lamb stew with dried fruits, burek, and rosewater sweets. You receive what your allocation specifies. The kitchen tracks the numbers. The portion is your rank, stated in food. The main kitchen doesn't guess. There's a documented record of who gets what, updated whenever rank changes, and the Ottoman palace kitchen during Suleiman I's reign was purchasing over 50,000 kilograms of sugar annually, according to treasury records, which gives you some sense of how seriously the institution took its dessert infrastructure. The rosewater honey mastic sweets aren't decorative, they're a ledger entry. The Valide Sultan's table gets them. Yours gets what comes after. Coffee runs on its own hierarchy entirely. Specialized attendants called cariyes manage the harem's coffee service, and they don't serve everyone the same way or at the same time. The cup that arrives at the Valide Sultan's audience room is attended to with a care that makes a modern Starbucks reserve bar look casual. Your cup arrives when it arrives. The cariyes who brings it knows your rank. The cup knows too, in the sense that its temperature reflects how long it waited before anyone considered you worth the walk. Meals are served in sequence and eaten largely in silence, because talking at the wrong pitch or duration in the wrong company is its own kind of miscalculation. The sound environment in the dining rooms is mostly running water from the courtyard channels, which were designed to muffle conversation, a feature that doubles as architecture and institutional policy. You eat. The water runs. The hierarchy eats above you. A kitchen carrier with flour still dusting her forearm crosses the corridor in front of the dining room with a covered copper tray. She is moving fast but not rushed. She does not look through the doorway. She has not been told not to. She has simply understood, across a year of work, that looking through this doorway is not what her arms are for. What nobody tells you when you arrive is that hunger is also rank-specific. Imagine a restaurant where the portion size depends not on what you ordered, but on who you are in the HOA directory. The portion sizes assigned to lower carriers are adequate, not generous. Adequate is a word that has a precise culinary definition inside Topkapı, and that definition is not the same as full. Higher-ranked ikbal and haseki receive dishes with dried fruit and additional courses. You finish yours and you don't ask for more. The hammam runs on a similar schedule. After the meal, the smell of the afternoon is olive oil soap and ardour, the depilatory paste made from sugar, lemon juice, and water boiled to a resin, applied every 2 to 4 weeks, and the steam carries all of it at once through the stone corridor. Wooden patterns clatter on the wet bath floors. The tiles in the senior women's hammam are Iznik work, cobalt and tomato red, depicting tulips and cypress trees. The tiles in the shared junior bath are also tiles. They're doing the same job. Nobody pretends otherwise. By evening, the kitchen smell drifts back through the complex. Not the saffron and pistachio version, the residual version. The smell of what was cooked for someone else, cooled and carried past your room on its way to wherever leftovers go in a building with its own treasury and hospital ward. An attendant carries a covered tray past your door. She doesn't pause. She doesn't look up. She has done this walk 900 times this year, and she will do it again tomorrow. The cloth over the tray is embroidered with a pattern you don't recognize, which means it belongs to a rank service you've never been near. You watch the corner of the cloth flicker past. Your own tray from this afternoon is still where you left it. The kitchen notices everything. The kitchen does not notice you. You practice the same passage on the UD until your fingertips go numb, and this isn't considered unusual. Music is one of the clearest paths upward available to a low-ranking woman, because performance happens in the presence of people who matter, and a good opinion from the right person can move you from a dormitory to a private room faster than any formal petition. The lesson is demanding. Your instructor knows the difference between talent and effort, so does everyone who will eventually be watching. The oud isn't the only option. Skilled women also trained in the kanun, a flat zither played across the lap, and the ney, a reed flute that takes months before it produces a sound anyone wants to hear twice. Percussion instruments appear in ensemble settings. What you're learning isn't casual entertainment, it's a performance repertoire in the Ottoman classical tradition, the same tradition practiced at formal court occasions. Your teacher isn't a volunteer. She's a kalfa, a senior woman with her own rank and her own debt of years, and she decides when you're ready to perform and when you absolutely are not. This is where the music lesson becomes something other than a music lesson. A performance in front of the Valide Sultan or a senior haseki isn't a recital, it's an audition with no posted vacancy. There's no application, no interview, no HR department processing your file, which is basically how all Ottoman career advancement worked, visible, personal, and entirely dependent on one person's mood on one specific afternoon. You play well, someone notices, someone says something to someone else. The pipeline is informal, the outcome is not. Calligraphy operates on the same logic. A well-executed piece of Quranic text, presented at the right moment to the right woman, carries weight beyond aesthetics. Senior women collected the work of promising cariyes the way a modern talent agency scouts a portfolio, except the talent agency is also your employer, your landlord, your legal guardian, and your only realistic exit from the dormitory. The calligraphy sits on the shelf. It doesn't advocate for itself, but the woman who made it is now slightly more visible than she was yesterday. Two cariyes are practicing on a oud in the inner courtyard, one passing the instrument to the other between repetitions. The second girl plays the passage better. The first girl does not react. She reaches for the oud again. Neither has said a word. The kalfa on the far side of the courtyard has not looked up once, which means she has heard every note. Embroidery is slower. The investment of hours is enormous. A single panel of gold thread court work could take months, and the resulting object often ended up as a gift upward, not downward. You embroider something beautiful and you give it away. This is correct behavior. The gift travels to a woman with more rooms than you, more candles than you, more fabric allotted per season than you've seen in a year. She accepts it. She may mention your name. She may not. The embroidery sits in her apartment in a building with Iznik tile revetments you've only seen from the corridor. Imagine giving away 3 months of your own hands and hoping, at best, someone says your name to someone else. The full curriculum, Ottoman Turkish, Quran, Islamic prayer, music, calligraphy, embroidery, and the dense layered protocols of court etiquette, takes several years to complete. New arrivals come in classified as asimi, meaning inexperienced, which is polite Ottoman bureaucratic language for you don't know anything yet, and you shouldn't be near anyone important. The training is basically a Navy SEAL BUD, S pipeline conducted in a conservatory, except failing out doesn't mean returning to the fleet. It means staying exactly where you are, indefinitely, and watching other people graduate past you. Not everyone advances. Most women don't. The dormitory holds 6 to 10 women to a chamber, and most of them are talented, and the rooms above them are finite. What moves you up isn't just skill. It's skill at the right moment, in the right room, noticed by the right person, who happens to be paying attention that afternoon rather than managing a political problem that has nothing to do with your UD playing. The passage you've been practicing is flawless now. Your fingertips have opinions about this. You don't approach the Valide Sultan without permission, and permission isn't something you request directly. Her authority over harem governance is formally recognized in imperial council decrees. She's not just a senior figure by custom, she's an institutional power in writing. Her daily life is managed through a buffer of attendants and senior kalfas who function as an intake desk for the rest of the compound. When you finally do gain an audience, there's a correct entrance, a correct posture, a correct angle for lowering your eyes, and a correct vocabulary for the request you're making. Getting any of it wrong isn't a minor error. The Valide Sultan's suite doesn't look like the rest of the harem. The Iznik tile revetments in her rooms run floor to ceiling, dense cobalt blue and tomato red tulips, carnations and cypress trees, considered among the finest ceramics produced anywhere in the world in the 16th century. She has a private bath, a formal audience room, and her own treasury. You sleep 6 to a chamber directly below tile work like that. The building isn't being subtle about the distinction. Her income isn't subtle either. The Valide Sultan's annual allowance could reach 3,000 gold sultani, roughly what a provincial governor earns managing an entire territory outside Istanbul. She controls her own financial resources, dispenses gifts and patronage, and funds construction projects outside the palace walls. This is basically the Forbes list, except entry requires surviving long enough to watch your son become sultan, which has its own set of complications. The senior Khalfas who manage access to her chambers keep their own informal ledger of who has requested what, when, and how persistently. You don't know exactly what's in that ledger, you're aware it exists. That awareness is, itself, part of the system. The cariyes, the specialized coffee attendants, move through the suite on a fixed rotation, and the quality of coffee served to a petitioner is, according to no official document and very widespread understanding, informative. You drink what you're given, and you do not comment on the temperature. Have you ever been served a cup of coffee that was both a courtesy and a performance review? This is one. A senior Khalfa at the threshold lifts one hand, palm down, and holds it. You stop. She does not turn her head. Somewhere inside the room, a conversation continues without you. When the hand lowers, you will be permitted to enter. It does not lower for some time. Meanwhile, the Valide Sultan's political reach extends past the outer walls in ways your daily life inside the compound doesn't fully touch. Nurbanu Sultan maintained active correspondence with Venetian diplomatic agents who cultivated her influence specifically to manage Ottoman-Venetian relations. Safiye Sultan exchanged letters and gifts directly with Queen Elizabeth I of England. Those letters survive in the British Museum, written by a woman purchased at a slave market and educated inside these walls, negotiating trade policy with a reigning monarch. The audience, if you get it, is brief. You state your request in the correct register of Ottoman Turkish, which you've spent years learning specifically for moments like this one. The Valide Sultan may respond directly or she may not. A senior Khalfa communicates the outcome afterward, in the corridor, in plain language. The outcome is final. There's no appeals process, no second window, no form for reconsideration. The door closes and the fountain in the adjacent courtyard continues running, which it does regardless of outcome, because water doesn't track outcomes. You know the rule, even though nobody explained it formally. One mother, one son. A woman who produces a male heir is affiliated with that child for the rest of her life, and her rank, income, security, and eventual political relevance all run through him. If another woman in the harem also produces a son, the dynamic between those two women becomes something the Ottoman Empire has an entire history of managing badly. Sons have been strangled, mothers have been exiled. The rule doesn't prohibit conflict, it structures it, which isn't necessarily better. The Ottoman succession system doesn't use primogeniture. The oldest son doesn't automatically inherit. Any eligible prince can take the throne. You know the name of every pregnant woman in the harem. You know the names of every prince currently living, their mothers, and which wing each one sleeps in. You have this memorized the way other people memorize prayers. Practically, this means your job doesn't end at childbirth. It expands. You're managing his household staff, his tutors, his reputation with the Sultan, and the temperature of every relationship that touches his future, which is basically the workload of a campaign manager, except the election is continuous and the other candidates' mothers are in the building with you. Picture a PTA meeting that never ends and where the minutes include phrases like possible strangulation. When a prince came of age, he was typically sent to govern a provincial sanjak, a regional posting designed to give him administrative experience. You went with him. The Eski Saray, where non-favoured women were housed, wasn't the destination you were angling for. The provincial posting was a promotion. It meant your son was being taken seriously, and being taken seriously was the only currency that mattered in a succession system with no fixed answer. The departure was its own signal. A mother leaving Topkapı with her son carried a specific weight. She was no longer ambient, no longer one of 400, no longer competing for corridor access and candle rations. She had a household. She had distance from the other mothers. Distance, in this context, had real administrative value. The problem arrives when the Sultan dies. At that moment, whichever son takes the throne becomes the new Sultan, and his mother becomes the Valide Sultan. Every other surviving prince becomes a liability. The fratricide law, Mehmed II's formal codification that it was legally permissible for a new sultan to execute his brothers to prevent civil war, wasn't secret. It was written down. It was policy. The Ottomans essentially invented the concept of making dynastic murder a line item in the legal code, which makes the Habsburg succession disputes look like a mildly contentious HOA meeting by comparison. For the mothers of non-succeeding sons, the calculus was grim and specific. If your son didn't take the throne, and if the sultan who did take the throne decided to enforce the fratricide provision, your son died and your position evaporated in a single administrative moment. Some mothers spent decades in provincial postings building a son's regional support network, cultivating relationships with local janissary commanders, managing correspondence with palace allies, and then received news that none of it had been sufficient. You watch the mother in the chamber down the corridor write 3 letters before noon and send a small silver dish, wrapped in cloth, to the Kızlar Ağzı's office every month for a year. You don't know what's in the letters. You know the dishes leave on a Wednesday and arrive empty back to her Thursday evening, and by the following spring her son has been assigned a better sanjak than his half-brother. None of it is accidental. None of it is discussed. The rule is simple. A Kalfa in the corridor mouths a prayer as she passes the prince's wing, then keeps walking. She has 12 more rooms to supervise before noon. You've been here long enough to understand the mechanics. Advancement begins with being seen. A woman who stays invisible to the Sultan doesn't advance. She ages in place until dismissed or dead. Yesterday morning, a Kalfa you've never spoken to adjusted the schedule so that your Quran recitation lesson now happens in the small courtyard near the audience corridor instead of the interior dormitory. You didn't ask for this. You don't know why. You arrive at the courtyard Thursday and you recite the second surah louder than you normally would. The kahveci cariyes, the specialized coffee attendants, are worth understanding specifically. They don't just carry trays. They move through the harem on a fixed daily circuit that touches nearly every rank in the hierarchy, which means they know who's receiving visitors, who's been crying, who hasn't eaten, and whose lamp was still lit past midnight. Information of this kind isn't sold, it's exchanged. You offer something back, a piece of news you overheard, a small kindness given at the right moment, the careful loan of social credibility when someone needs it. The coffee arrives. The coffee attendant remembers. The physical architecture works against you in some rooms and for you in others. The shared dormitory chambers, where lower-ranking cariyes sleep 6 to 10 to a room, directly beneath some of the finest Iznik tilework in the world, offer almost no privacy, which means they offer almost no silence. You know everyone's business because there's no structural way to keep it. That sounds like a disadvantage. It isn't, entirely. What you hear in a shared room at night is more accurate than anything presented in a formal audience. The tilework doesn't comment on any of this. It just flowers across the ceiling, blue and red and permanent, while the room below it conducts its nightly informational economy. Senior women, the ikbal and above, have rooms of their own, which is basically the Ottoman equivalent of getting a private office at Google, except there's no HR department, and losing the room means your career trajectory has reversed in a way that won't be documented anywhere. Last winter, an ikbal 3 doors down stopped receiving visitors and was moved back to a shared chamber within a fortnight. The woman who replaced her in the private room brought her own divan. You pass the door every morning. The divan is a darker red than the old one. Being noticed by the Sultan is the goal, but it's not a goal you pursue directly. You pursue the women who arrange proximity. You cultivate the Kalfa who schedules music performances. You're correct in assuming that the Valide Sultan already knows your name. She knows everyone's name. But being known and being considered are 2 different things. One costs nothing. The other takes years. Imagine trying to get promoted at a company where your boss is your boss's mother and the hiring committee is whichever woman happens to be in the corridor at 3 p.m. The Khalfas who manage daily schedules, room assignments, and access to the Sultan's path through the harem are, functionally, the most useful people you can know. They're not making decisions about your rank. They're making decisions about your location at a given hour, which amounts to the same thing. A Khalfa who likes you might place you where a route passes. A Khalfa who doesn't can arrange for you to spend an entire season in a room. The Sultan has no reason to enter. You carry a pouch of sugared almonds to the Khalfa who runs the music rotation on the first Friday of every month. You don't say anything when you hand it over. She doesn't say anything when she takes it. The Khalfa you've been courting for a year passes you in the corridor, and her gaze crosses yours for half a second longer than usual. That is the entire conversation. You continue toward prayer. Somewhere behind you, she has already rearranged the afternoon's lesson locations. You will not know this for 2 days. The official documents cover rank, allowances, room assignments, once formalized. Your candle ration appears on a ledger, the treasury updates monthly, your new fabric quota appears on a slip the Khalfa hands you in the afternoon. What doesn't appear on any slip is the pouch of sugared almonds, or the surah you recited a little louder in the small courtyard on Thursday, or the specific hour you walked past the Qızlı Ars's door on your way to nowhere in particular. You learn to read a room by its sounds. Running water from the decorative fountain channels means the public courtyard is occupied and social. Quran recitation from the direction of the mosque wing means the morning schedule is running late. Kitchen smells arriving from the east corridor mean the afternoon meal timing has shifted, and someone senior made a request that changed the day. The harem tells you things constantly. Staying visible means staying fluent in what it's saying. You become gözde, noticed, the night the Sultan selects you, and the word travels through the harem before morning. Your room assignment adjusts. Your silver allowance adjusts. The careful attention of every woman whose position your advancement might affect adjusts, in ways you can feel but not always trace. If you become pregnant, the stakes climb again. A pregnancy makes you ikbal. A live male birth makes you haseki, if the Sultan acknowledges it. The sequence is straightforward in theory. In practice, it runs through social pressures and rival interests that begin the moment anyone else finds out. Take a breath. The night itself is prepared for with the same institutional care as everything else in this building. You're bathed. The hammam attendants apply arda, the sugar and lemon depilatory paste, which is not pleasant and takes longer than you'd expect. Your hair is dressed. You're given specific garments, specific scent, specific jewelry scaled to your current rank. Nothing in this preparation is improvised. The palace has done this before, many times. The building itself knows the protocol. Afterward, you don't return to a dormitory sleeping 6 to a room. You're assigned a separate room or a partitioned space, depending on the current occupancy situation and what the household can spare. The material change is immediate, which is basically checking into a hotel upgrade you didn't request, except the concierge is a Khalfa who now watches you very carefully, and the checkout date is undefined. Your candle ration increases. Someone notes this in a ledger somewhere. The ledger doesn't have opinions. Everyone else does. What nobody tells you directly is that a gözde who doesn't become pregnant relatively quickly tends to fade. The Sultan's attention isn't a contract. There's no renewal clause. Have you ever been promoted once, and then watched everyone above you quietly decide that was probably enough? Women who are noticed once and then not again occupy a specific uncomfortable position in the hierarchy, ranked above cariyes, below ikbal, acknowledged but not advancing. One of them eats across from you at the afternoon meal. She has been eating across from you for 4 years. She was noticed once, in 1654, and then not after that. She passes the bread without looking up. A confirmed pregnancy changes the social temperature of your immediate environment in ways that are difficult to overstate. Other women's Khalfas start appearing with small courtesies, a particular pastry, an inquiry after your health, an offer to arrange something. This is basically Amazon same-day delivery, except what's being delivered is political goodwill, and what's being tracked is whether you're useful yet. You accept the courtesies. You don't mistake them for friendship. You've been in this building long enough to know the difference. A Khalfa from a wing you've never been assigned to arrives with a small dish of quince paste on a square of white linen. She sets it on the edge of the table, inclines her head a fraction, and leaves. You have not met her before. You will meet her again. The quince paste is the receipt for a transaction that has not yet happened. The Valide Sultan is informed, not by you, by the household mechanisms that report to her as a matter of course. She may send acknowledgement, she may not. Her response, or the deliberate absence of it, is itself a message that every experienced woman in the harem will read correctly. You learn to read it too. There's no written guide. The literacy is entirely social, and it develops fast under these conditions, or not at all. A male birth, if it comes, is announced with specific ceremonial forms, cannon fire from the palace walls, gifts distributed to palace staff by rank. The scale of celebration is calibrated to the mother's standing and the sultan's visible pleasure, and everyone present is reading both simultaneously. You've just produced something the Ottoman succession machinery requires. The machinery notices. Eventually a tutor arrives to take your son. You stand in the corridor, and the door closes, and you count the seconds until you can hear his footsteps no longer. You find out about the demotion before it's announced, because that's how information moves here, not through official channels, but through the women who carry trays, overhear conversations, and pass messages that are never written down. A Kalfa notices something. She tells someone. That someone tells someone else. By the time the formal decision arrives, everyone who needs to know already knows, and everyone who needed time to adjust has already adjusted. Your position within this network is as important as your formal rank. Some days it's more important. The cariyes, the women whose specific job is managing the harem's coffee service, move through more rooms in a single morning than you'll see in a week. They're in the Valide Sultan's anteroom at dawn. They're in the senior haseki's corridor by mid-morning. They're refilling the cup of a Kalfa who happens to be sitting next to someone who happened to hear something. Coffee is the infrastructure. The information travels on top of it. This is basically Slack, except the messages delete themselves and the read receipts are a curtain shifting slightly when you walk past. The network isn't organized. Nobody appointed a coordinator. There's no weekly sync and no org chart with dotted lines. What there is, 400 women in 5,000 square meters who have nothing to gain from being uninformed and everything to lose from being surprised. The system runs itself because the incentives are obvious and the consequences aren't. A woman who knows what's coming can position herself. A woman who doesn't finds out the hard way, usually when her candle ration changes without explanation. You learn to read the secondary signals before you learn to read the primary ones. Have you ever walked into a room and instantly known something was happening that nobody was going to tell you about? Welcome to every corridor here. If two Kalfas stop a conversation when you approach, that's information. If a senior woman's attendant suddenly becomes very busy with tasks that keep her near the Valide Sultan's suite, that's information. If the coffee arrives slightly later than usual to a particular room, you note it. You don't say anything. You file it. The women who rise fastest inside the harem aren't always the most beautiful or the most musically accomplished. They're the ones who've mastered the gap between what's said and what's meant, which is basically a Jane Austen novel, except the stakes are considerably higher and nobody ends up at a pleasant country estate. Two Kalfas are standing at the long window in the outer corridor. One of them is holding a small silver bowl. Neither is drinking from it. Their shoulders are turned a hand's width toward each other. They have not said a word in the 40 seconds you have been watching. Something has been decided. You do not know what. You will know by morning. Rumours move faster than decrees. A rumour about a favourite standing can circulate through the full complex in under an hour, through dormitories, past the hammam, into the kitchens, back through the corridors near the treasury, before anyone with authority has said a single official word. The rumour is often wrong in its details and right in its direction. That combination is enough. Some information travels deliberately. A senior woman wants a message delivered, not written, never written, and she asks someone she trusts to carry it to someone else who'll understand what it means without being told what to do with it. The message has no author. It has no trail. It arrives exactly where it was aimed. The Kalfas manage most of this. They're the middle layer, above the cariyes, below the haseki, and their whole professional value depends on being useful to multiple people simultaneously without becoming visibly loyal to any single one. It's a narrow corridor to walk. The ones who walk it well last decades. The ones who misjudge it find themselves reassigned to duties that keep them very busy and very far from anyone who matters. You are somewhere in this network right now. You're not sure exactly where. That uncertainty is itself the information you should be paying attention to. You need a letter taken out of the harem, and the path runs through a black eunuch. You stop at the inner gate. You hand the folded paper to a junior member of the Harem Alaru who is stationed there every morning between the first and second prayer. He takes it without reading it. He doesn't read it in front of you. Whether he reads it later is a question you're not in a position to ask. Upward of him is a senior eunuch. Upward of that is another one, and at the top is the Kızlar Ağası, whose office holds the third highest protocol rank in the empire. Almost every man in this corps came from sub-Saharan Africa, Sudan, Ethiopia, the interior regions the Ottoman trade routes reached. The castration that qualified them for this role wasn't performed inside Ottoman territory. It happened in Coptic Christian monasteries in Upper Egypt, near Asyut, which is a little like saying the paperwork was processed offshore to avoid a regulatory problem, except the paperwork in this case is surgical, and the regulatory problem is both Ottoman law and Islamic law simultaneously. The monasteries didn't advertise the service. It existed anyway. The Ottoman Empire had a sophisticated relationship with inconvenient logistics. The mortality rate from the operation was somewhere between 40 and 60%. That number sits there. It doesn't ask you to respond to it. The men who survived arrived at Topkapı already having cleared a threshold that most people wouldn't survive, which gave the corps a particular quality, not ruthlessness exactly, but a complete absence of surprise at anything the institution required of them. The Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch, ran the corps and also managed the harem's financial administration, controlled access to the sultan, and served as a communication channel between the Valide Sultan and the imperial council. His position sat below the Grand Vizier and the chief white eunuch, which is basically a C-suite.org chart where the third slot controls everything the top two slots need to actually function. You see him cross the second courtyard once a morning, in a wide robe that trails by a hand's width behind him, and you step aside before the Khalfa beside you has to signal it. A junior eunuch at the inner gate holds the folded letter against his palm for a moment, before slipping it into the inner sleeve of his robe. He does not acknowledge that you are still standing there. You are no longer part of what happens next. You turn. The letter is now somewhere you cannot follow. The doors the black eunuchs control aren't just physical. A message that doesn't move through the right hands doesn't move. A petition that arrives at the wrong moment doesn't arrive at all. You learn this quickly. You draft carefully. You choose your courier with the same attention you'd give to the content of what you're sending, because the courier is part of the content. Have you ever written a letter and then spent longer choosing who would carry it than you spent writing it? That's the arithmetic here. A note carried by the wrong person says something about you before it's read. A note that arrives late says something different. You once gave a letter to a junior eunuch whose uncle, you'd heard, worked in the Grand Vizier's stables. The letter arrived. The reply came back faster than anything you'd sent before. Senior eunuchs who serve long enough build their own networks inside the harem, relationships with Khalfas, awareness of which women have the Valide Sultan's ear, knowledge of timing. This is basically an uber-black tier of professional favour trading, except every connection is confidential, there's no rating system, and getting it wrong ends your career in a direction the app has not modelled. You pass the same senior eunuch in the corridor at the same hour 3 days in a row, and on the fourth day your candle ration appears 1 candle over quota. Nobody mentions it. You don't mention it either. You file the candle. You know who the Kızlar Ağası is before you've been here a week, because everyone makes sure you know. The chief black eunuch holds the third highest protocol rank in the palace, below only the Grand Vizier and the chief white eunuch, and his proximity to the harem's senior women makes him one of the most politically connected figures in the empire. He delivers messages to the Sultan, controls access to the Valide Sultan, administers the harem's endowment funds, and carries the ceremonial purse at major court events. The Grand Vizier technically outranks him. The Grand Vizier knows it. Meet the Kızlar Ağası. Not a villain, not an ally. The man who decides at 4:47 a.m. on a Tuesday whether your letter reaches Venice. The endowment funds alone are worth pausing on. The Kızlar Ağası oversees the Waqf revenues, pious endowments attached to mosques, schools and charitable institutions across the empire, which means he controls significant incoming cash flows, completely independent of the main treasury. You see the revenue registers being carried into his office in a locked wooden chest on the last day of every month. 2 junior eunuchs carry the chest. One of them has a limp. The chest goes in full. It comes out empty 3 days later, and the Khalfas on that corridor lower their voices when they pass that door. His day runs on movement. Picture a man whose job is, essentially, being the most important door in the empire. You watch him cross the second courtyard at a pace that suggests he's never not in the middle of something, which he isn't. A message goes from the Valide Sultan's suite through him to the Sultan's apartments, and back. The Sultan's response goes back through him. Nothing between the harem and the throne moves without passing through this office. The door doesn't open itself. He's the door. Senior eunuchs below him operate the same way at smaller scale, each controlling a corridor, a gate, a roster of women permitted to move between sections on a given day. The permission system is entirely oral. There's no ticket, no form, no clipboard. There's a face you have to recognize and a name that has to already be known. If neither condition is met, you wait. The waiting area is a corridor. The corridor is cold. The corridor doesn't apologize. The Qızlar Ağası also supervises the holy cities. His formal title includes custodianship over the endowments of Mecca and Medina, which sounds ceremonial until you remember it means he controls which institutions get funded and at what level, in the two most politically sensitive cities in the Islamic world. It's the Ottoman equivalent of a single administrator quietly managing the Vatican's property portfolio while also being the only person allowed to knock on the Pope's door. Nobody says that out loud. The comparison would not be welcome. Your Kalfa once gestured toward his door and said, under her breath, that the woman who ran the Valide Sultan's second cup of coffee service had given him a gift at Ramadan for 11 consecutive years. The Kalfa didn't say what the gift was. She also didn't say whether the gift worked. She said the number. You counted it back once in your head. Because 11 Ramadans is a long time to be paying a specific man for a specific outcome you may or may not be getting. The current Qızlar Ağası has held the office for 22 years. He walks the second courtyard every morning at the same hour. A junior eunuch trails him by exactly 3 paces. Never 2, never 4. You've watched this from the corridor. The distance doesn't vary. The Grand Vizier passes the same courtyard later in the morning, and the distance between him and his attendant is less consistent. You know the black eunuchs arrived here already castrated, and you know the Ottoman legal framework technically prohibits the operation. What you may not have worked out yet is how those two facts coexist without contradiction. The answer is geography. The castration was performed outside Ottoman territory, typically in Coptic Christian monasteries in Upper Egypt near Asyut, which satisfies the letter of the law without troubling its spirit. The mortality rate from the operation was somewhere between 40 and 60%. The survivors were transported north. The paperwork was clean. Take a breath. This part is the one you might have been avoiding thinking about. The Coptic monasteries near Asyut didn't advertise this service. It's not on any brochure. But the arrangement was sufficiently regularized that the supply chain functioned reliably for centuries, which is the Ottoman Empire's way of saying, everyone involved understood what was happening and continued to show up for work. Boys were sourced primarily from Sudan and Ethiopia, which places their point of origin roughly 2,000 miles from the palace corridors where they'd eventually spend their careers. The distance was deliberate. Not legally, not officially, just practically. You've never asked any of them where they're from. Nobody here asks any of them where they're from. The boys who didn't survive the operation are not in the palace records. The boys who did are listed by new name, new title, new rank. The old name doesn't follow them north. Neither does the village, the family, the language. What follows them is a job description and a hierarchy to climb, which is basically the Amazon warehouse onboarding experience, except the career ceiling is the 3rd highest protocol rank in the empire. That ceiling is real. The Qızlar Ağası sits in formal Ottoman precedence below only the Grand Vizier and the chief white eunuch. At court ceremonies his position is fixed, recognized, and non-negotiable. You've watched the current one cross the second courtyard. Several Qızlar Ağası have accumulated personal fortunes, built mosques under their own names, and endowed charitable foundations that outlasted the sultans they'd served. The job has a genuine upside. It requires surviving the job interview, which is the hard part. A junior eunuch stands in the outer corridor before first prayer. He is not waiting for anyone. He is not assigned a task at this hour. He stands there because standing there is where he has taught himself the day begins. He does not move until a senior eunuch passes, and then he falls in behind, 3 paces back, the way the one before him did. European observers document the black eunuchs with the same combination of fascination and condescension they apply to everything else in the palace. Venetian diplomatic reports note their presence, their authority, their distinctive dress. A Venetian bailo passes one of them in the second courtyard in 1579 and writes home about the robe, the walking stick, the accompanying retinue of 4 junior eunuchs. The bailo does not note that the man he's describing also signs off on the Waqf accounts for the holy mosques. The bailo doesn't know that part. The senior eunuch closest to your dormitory corridor has held that post for longer than you've been in the building. You don't know where he came from. You don't know what language he spoke before Ottoman Turkish. He holds the keys to 3 of the 4 corridors your life is bounded by, and you nod at him on the way to prayer. He nods back. Nobody has ever discussed Upper Egypt in your presence, and nobody ever will. You're copying a letter in Ottoman script, and the recipient is Queen Elizabeth I of England. Safiye Sultan, Valide Sultan, and mother of Mehmed III, maintains active diplomatic correspondence with foreign heads of state, and the letters she sends in 1599 discuss trade routes and political alliance. They survive today in the British Museum. They weren't informal notes. They were state documents between 2 institutional powers, written by a woman who, in the European imagination, was supposed to be spending her time decoratively. Safiye Sultan didn't appear to have received that particular memo. Let's talk about the letter. It's not a note. It's state policy folded into 4. The letter is why a junior Khalfa carries a folded square of paper from one wing of the palace to another on a specific afternoon. The letter is why a Venetian interpreter has been waiting in an outer room since before first prayer. The letter is why the Kızlı Arsız door opened twice this morning and will open once more before dusk. The gifts travelled with the letters. Safiye Sultan sent Elizabeth I a robe, a jewelled crown, a girdle, 2 gold and jewel-encrusted pairs of slippers, a ruby pin, a hand mirror, and a brocade gown. Elizabeth sent back coach horses and a coach, which Safiye Sultan reportedly found interesting enough to ride through the palace grounds, to the visible confusion of several courtiers. Picture it. A Valide Sultan taking a Tudor-era gift vehicle for a spin inside Topkapı while her attendants try to figure out where to stand. Neither woman had ever met the other. Neither needed to. Nurbanu Sultan worked the same channel a generation earlier, except her contact was Venice. Venetian diplomatic agents cultivated her systematically, the way modern lobbying firms cultivate committee chairs, with gifts, attention, and the steady application of patience. Nurbanu's access to Selim II made her a more reliable back-channel than half the official ambassadors in Istanbul. The Venetian state papers record her interventions in treaty negotiations with the kind of dry bureaucratic specificity that leaves no doubt about what she actually was, an informal foreign minister operating from inside the harem walls. Leslie Peirce's 1993 book pulled these women out of the footnotes and into the main text, drawing on Muhime Defterleri, imperial council registers, to show that Valide Sultan authority appeared in official governmental decrees, not implied. Written down, stamped, filed. The archive knew what European painters hadn't bothered to ask about. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres spent years on his 1862 painting Le Bain Turc, depicting the harem as a pool of intertwined naked women in a round room. Not one surviving floor plan of Topkapı contains a round room. He was painting a fantasy with the confidence of a man who'd never needed to check. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu arrived in Istanbul in 1717 and actually looked. Her Turkish embassy letters, published in 1763, are the corrective record, an outside observer who went to the baths, spoke to the women, and came back with a more accurate account than anything produced by a European diplomat or painter. She also came back with Ottoman variolation, the smallpox inoculation technique practiced in Istanbul, which she introduced to England and which eventually contributed to vaccine development. She observed a medical procedure that would save millions of lives, wrote it up clearly, and was largely ignored for a decade. The letters fared somewhat better. A Khalfa enters with a cup of coffee for the corner of the room. She does not set it at Safiye's elbow. She sets it on the small table nearest the door, the corner reserved for whoever is present but not participating. The cup is yours. You have not looked up. The coffee is the acknowledgement that you are still copying. Safiye Sultan's letters to Elizabeth weren't translated from a simpler private register. They were composed in the formal Ottoman diplomatic style, with the correct honorifics, the correct structure, and the correct political framing. You finish the copy. You hand it to the senior Khalfa, who hands it to a junior eunuch, who hands it to the Kızlı Arsız office before the morning is out. The Valide Sultan's annual income could reach 3,000 gold sultani, roughly a provincial governor's salary, and she spent some of it on foreign policy. The rest of it she managed herself. The British Museum has the receipts. You understand the mechanics because you've watched Nurbanu Sultan work them first. Nurbanu, Valide Sultan from 1574 to 1583, mother of Murad III, maintained sustained contact with Venetian diplomatic agents who cultivated her influence specifically to manage Ottoman-Venetian relations. The Venetians were pragmatic. They knew where the access was, and they maintained it carefully, expensively, and with full attention to the preferences of the person they were trying to keep on side. The source happened to live in a palace most Europeans imagined was sealed to the outside world. The Venetians knew better. The gifts moved in both directions. Venetian diplomatic records, Bailo dispatches, filed regularly with the Senate in Venice, document what was sent, what was received, and how warmly the relationship was maintained. Bolts of Venetian silk, glassware from Murano, perfumes. The Venetians weren't guessing at what Nurbanu liked. They asked. They tracked the answers. They were, functionally, running a key account management operation, which is basically what Salesforce was designed to replace, except Nurbanu's pipeline closed treaties instead of software subscriptions. Nurbanu had been born on the island of Corfu, captured or purchased young, converted, trained, elevated through exactly the system you've already watched operate across 200 years of palace hierarchy. By the time the Venetians needed her, she'd spent decades learning how an empire makes its decisions. She knew which petitions reached the Sultan's attention and which didn't. She knew the order in which advisors entered a room. She knew the gap between what the Grand Vizier said officially and what got discussed afterward. The Venetians weren't cultivating a symbol. They were cultivating someone with better information than most of the people they could legally meet. The Bailo dispatches describe her in specific terms. Intelligent, reliable, expensive to maintain. That last part wasn't a complaint. The Venetians considered it the cost of doing business in Istanbul, and they paid it without visible resentment, which tells you something about the return on investment. Have you ever wondered what an expense line item reads like when it's labelled Ottoman Valide Sultan Annual Cultivation? The Venetian Senate filed one. What she receives in exchange isn't only gifts. Venetian diplomatic priorities get heard. Ottoman-Venetian tensions that might have escalated get managed. You watch a junior Kalfa carry a sealed cylinder from Nurbanu's suite to the Kızlar Ağas's office, twice a week, for most of a decade. Nobody asks what's in the cylinder. The cylinders leave, and treaties follow 3 or 4 months later, and the connection between those two facts is not something anyone in the harem discusses at meal service. A senior Kalfa walks the length of the outer corridor with a sealed cylinder held against her sleeve. She does not look at the doorways she passes. Her pace is the same pace a woman carrying linen would walk. Nobody looks up as she passes. Not looking up is its own kind of professionalism. The cylinder reaches the Kızlar Ağas's office before the second prayer. It does not come back. Leslie Peirce's archival work in the Muhimi Defterleri, the Imperial Council registers, confirmed that Valide Sultan authority appeared in official governmental decrees, not just in diplomatic gossip or European dispatches. The records named her. The state named her. The Ottoman bureaucracy, which had opinions about everything and documented most of them, documented her in a ledger that a historian 400 years later would pull off a shelf in Istanbul and open in good light. The Venetians kept the relationship going for years. After Nurbanu died in 1583, they redirected attention to Sophia Sultan. You watch the same senior Kalfa who used to run Nurbanu's correspondence begin to appear in Sophie's corridor, carrying the same kind of sealed cylinder on what looks like the same schedule. The Venetian gifts arrive within the year. Pragmatic people, the Venetians. You're living in the consequence of a decision made 2 generations before you arrived. Before Hürrem Sultan, royal women were housed in the Eski Saray, the old palace, kept at a deliberate remove from the seat of government. Moving Hürrem into Topkapı wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a structural change that placed a woman with political relationships and real authority inside the government rather than at its edge. Every rank, every diplomatic letter, every piece of institutional machinery you navigate daily exists because someone moved a woman across the city. The Eski Saray sat west of Topkapı, across the city, which is where Istanbul University now stands. The distance wasn't accidental. Before Hürrem, The separation of royal women from the palace was deliberate policy. You conducted your life in a residential compound that had no formal relationship to the rooms where the empire was actually run. You could receive visitors, you could write letters, you could have opinions. None of it touched the Grand Council chamber because you weren't in the same building. Hürrem changed that around 1541. The exact date isn't recorded, which feels fitting for a move that was officially not supposed to mean anything. Suleiman the Magnificent had already legally married her, also unprecedented, and now she moved into Topkapı and stayed there. Contemporaries were unsettled. Ottoman diplomatic records from the period register polite discomfort from foreign ambassadors who weren't quite sure how to categorize a royal consort with a permanent address inside the seat of government. The Venetian bailo filed a dispatch about it. Everything. Hürrem's surviving letters show she wasn't just present, she was working. She wrote to Suleiman in Ottoman Turkish with a command of court poetic conventions that matches trained literary correspondence, which is basically a cold email that also scans as verse and lands a trade concession. The letters discuss politics, family and foreign affairs with the same register. She corresponded with Sigismund II of Poland. She coordinated charitable endowments in Jerusalem. She was not decorating a room. Imagine the diplomatic equivalent of opening an email that reads, "In flawless 14-syllable couplets, a genuine policy proposal." That's a normal Tuesday for Hürrem. The women who came after her inherited a physical position, inside Topkapı, that carried institutional weight precisely because she'd normalized it. By the time Valide Sultan held the Valide suite a generation later, the harem's proximity to the Grand Council wasn't controversial. It was just where things happened. The Eski Saray didn't disappear. It became a retirement compound, which is the Ottoman equivalent of receiving an Amtrak Acela business class upgrade to a train whose only scheduled stop is the station you are trying to leave. A Kalfa walking beside you points downward without breaking stride. The floor stones change colour under her finger, older stones on one side, newer on the other. She does not explain. You understand anyway. The seam is the argument. You pass Hürrem's original apartment now on your way to the afternoon music lesson. Someone else lives there. The Iznik tile in the doorway is cobalt and a red so dark it reads almost black in winter light. The stone corridor outside it was widened in the 1580s to accommodate the foot traffic of people who needed to pass messages to whoever was in that room next. And the widening is visible in the floor. The older stones are a different colour than the newer ones, and the seam runs right across the threshold. The Eski Saray, meanwhile, sits under a university library. It doesn't comment on this. You govern from inside. If your son is Sultan, you are Valide Sultan, and the period later Ottoman historians call the Sultanate of Women, roughly 1550 to 1750, is what that looks like at scale. Mothers managing imperial councils, directing campaigns, negotiating foreign policy, issuing orders the council acts on. Your annual income reaches 3,000 gold sultani. A provincial governor earns about the same. The Ottoman state assigned both roles the same administrative weight, which isn't metaphor, it's what the salary records show. The comparison isn't flattering to the provincial governor. The orders you issue don't arrive unsigned. They arrive with your tugra, your formal monogram, attached to decrees that the imperial council then acts on, because the council knows where the sultan came from and who he still listens to. Leslie Peirce spent years in the Ottoman archive reading the Muhimi Defterleri, the Imperial Council's own working registers, and found your name in them. Not as a footnote. As a directing authority. The archive isn't sentimental about this. Neither are you, Sophia Sultan writes to Queen Elizabeth I. Not informally, formally, with gifts, with diplomatic intent, discussing trade routes and political arrangements. The letters survive in the British Museum, which is the diplomatic equivalent of a paper trail that refuses to cooperate with the fantasy that you weren't doing anything important, Elizabeth writes back. The two women are running foreign policy simultaneously from opposite ends of Europe, and neither one has an office with a window facing outward. Sophia's window faces a courtyard, Elizabeth's faces a garden. The correspondence continues anyway. Valide Sultan manages the Venetian relationship with the patience of someone who understands that the Venetians will keep showing up regardless, so you might as well make the arrangement deliberate. Venetian diplomatic agents cultivate her specifically. They write home about her. Their dispatches describe a woman who knows exactly what she's worth to them and charges accordingly. The Venetians are, in this period, basically a trade delegation that also does intelligence work, and Nabanu is the most important meeting on their calendar. A senior Kalfa carries a sealed tray of documents across the inner courtyard. Two junior Kalfas fall in behind her. None of them speak. The tray reaches the Kızlaras's door and the door opens before anyone has knocked. The door was expecting the tray. You have watched this choreography 4 times this week, and you have never once heard a word exchanged. The mechanics of your authority aren't mysterious. Your son is Sultan. He was Sultan before he understood what that meant, and you understood it first and longer. The harem produced him, educated him, placed him. You don't need a title on a door. The door opens because you knock on it, and the Grand Vizier on the other side of it has known you since he was working his way up through the Enderun School, which is basically the Harvard Business School pipeline of the Ottoman administrative class, except every graduate ends up reporting to someone whose mother is you. Hürrem Sultan runs the empire as regent for 2 consecutive child sultans, which is the kind of sentence that makes European diplomatic reports from the period read like dispatches from a country the sender didn't fully understand before arriving. She corresponds with officials, manages appointments, controls revenue streams. She does this for decades. The empire doesn't pause to remark on this. The empire has paperwork to process. Have you ever wondered what a 2-decade regency looks like when nobody in Europe is willing to call it that out loud? It looks like this. The ending, when it comes inside the harem. Hürrem is strangled with a curtain cord in her own bedroom by servants loyal to her rival Turhan Sultan. The curtain cord belongs to the palace. The palace has opinions about succession, and those opinions are occasionally structural. Turhan takes the regency. The paperwork continues without a gap you'd notice from the outside. A provincial governor would not have survived the transition at all. You know there are princes in this building. Somewhere in a suite called the Caves, the Cage, the Sultan's brothers, half-brothers, and potential successors are confined without governance education, without outside contact, and without anything that would prepare them to rule. Ibrahim I spent 22 years in the cafes before being made Sultan. The historical record on his reign suggests this was not an ideal preparation. The institution considered it an acceptable outcome. You don't interact with the princes directly. You know they're there, and you know what the cafes produces, and neither fact is comforting. The cafes exists because the previous solution was worse. Before confinement became standard practice, Ottoman succession was settled by fratricide. The new sultan executed his brothers on the day he took the throne, which is efficient, if you don't think too hard about it. The cafes replaced immediate killing with indefinite waiting. You hear about Ibrahim I from a Kalfa who served in that wing for 6 years. The Kalfa doesn't describe his state. She describes the number of lamps he kept lit through the night, which was more than his candle ration permitted, and which nobody ever reported, because nobody on that corridor reported anything about him ever. The Cafes is why the Ottoman succession no longer required executing brothers on the day a new sultan took the throne. The cafes is why a prince might spend 30 years in a suite with no governance education and then be handed an empire on a Thursday. The cafes is why the kalfas on that corridor walk with a particular quiet the rest of the harem learns to recognize without being told. The kafas suite has women in it. A small number of concubines are assigned to confined princes, a detail that sounds like a comfort until you realize it's also a surveillance system. The women are there, and they report. And the princes know they report. It's basically a company apartment with a wellness coordinator whose primary function is HR compliance. The prince has companions and absolutely no privacy, which is the opposite of solitude and not meaningfully better. Prince Ibrahim emerges in 1640 convinced that people are trying to kill him, because people have been trying to kill him, intermittently, for his entire adult life. This is not paranoia in the clinical sense, it's pattern recognition. He rules for 8 years. His reign includes the conquest of Crete, which is a genuine military achievement, and a number of other decisions that Ottoman chroniclers record with the careful neutrality of people who know someone might read this later. He's deposed and strangled by his own officials in 1648. The Cafes produced a sultan, and the sultanate returned the favour. You don't spend time near the Cafes wing if you can avoid it. It's not forbidden to you exactly, but proximity to confined princes carries its own kind of institutional risk, the wrong association at the wrong moment, noted by the wrong person. The harem's information network, which you've been living inside for years, runs right up to the edge of the cafes and stops. What happens inside stays inside. You know the outline. You fill in the rest yourself, which is probably accurate enough. A kalfa assigned to the cafe's corridor crosses the inner courtyard at a pace slower than everyone else's pace. She is not carrying anything. She passes through and is gone, and the courtyard does not resume the same sound level for several seconds afterward. Nobody comments on this. Nobody ever does. The strangest part isn't the confinement. It's that this is the official backup plan for the empire. The Ottoman succession system is basically a AAA roadside assistance plan where the tow truck has been idling in a locked garage for 20 years and nobody's checked whether the engine still turns over. If the Sultan dies without an obvious heir, the court opens the cafes and selects whoever is left standing upright. That man then runs one of the most complex administrative empires on earth. The transition meeting is brief. The learning curve is not. Suleiman II spent 39 years in the cafes before ruling. He was reportedly so certain of his execution when the officials arrived that he'd already prepared for death. When they told him he was Sultan, he didn't believe them immediately. The officials waited. He accepted. He ruled for 4 years. You'd think by now someone would have written a handbook for the transition. Nobody had. The Kalfa, who had served his wing through most of those 39 years, retired to a small apartment in the outer harem and never spoke about the work. You've seen her once. She drinks her coffee slowly. You're close to your time, and the harem's medical protocols have already begun, more formal than you expected. 2 trained attendants arrive at your chamber at dawn. A senior Kalfa sets down a wooden tray holding clean linen, a small silver vessel, and a reed pen with ink. The pen is for the record. The attendants carry you through the corridor to the designated berthing space. You count the doors as you pass them because counting is something you can still do. The attendants around you aren't exclusively there for comfort. Some are witnesses. The documentation of a royal birth, who was present, what was said when the child drew breath, exists because succession disputes are an empire's most reliably recurring administrative problem. The record doesn't comfort you. It validates the outcome. You are part of the outcome. The room has opinions about which part. If the child is a boy and he lives, your rank changes. A healthy male heir makes you a haseki, or confirms the rank if you already held it, which is basically getting a permanent promotion with no ceremony, no letter, and no one saying it out loud. It simply becomes true, and everyone adjusts. Your axi allowance increases. Your candle ration increases. You move rooms. The new room is larger. The tiles in it are better. The Iznik tile work in the senior suites runs floor to ceiling in cobalt blue and tomato red, tulips, carnations, cypress trees, and it is, genuinely, some of the finest ceramic work produced anywhere in the world in the 16th century. You now live inside it. Nobody remarks on this either. If the child is a girl, your rank improves, but more modestly. Girls don't anchor succession. They're marriageable, which has its own diplomatic utility. The forms still get filled out. The witnesses still file out. The room doesn't change. Your daughter sleeps on the same mat you do for the first 6 weeks. If the child doesn't survive, and infant mortality inside the harem ran at rates that would make a modern pediatric ward look like a controlled clinical environment, you return to your previous rank with no formal acknowledgement that anything happened. The record notes the birth, the record notes the death, the record moves on. You're expected to do the same. On a timeline, the record doesn't specify. Childbirth itself is managed by the harem's own medical staff. By the 17th century, the compound included a dedicated hospital ward, which sounds reassuring until you remember that 17th century hospital wards were not reassuring. Trained midwives handled deliveries. Palace physicians, who were male and therefore not permitted inside the harem proper, consulted from the other side of a partition when things went wrong. The partition has a long history of not solving the problem. Have you ever tried to diagnose an emergency through a curtain? Neither had they really, but they kept trying. A midwife sits on a low stool at the foot of the bedding with a folded cloth in both hands. She does not speak. She does not move. She is waiting, which is most of her work on a morning like this. Across the room, the senior Kalfa has her reed pen open over the ledger. The page is blank. Neither woman is in a hurry. The room is quieter than any room in this building. The Valide Sultan, if she's invested in the outcome, is nearby. Her investment is practical. A grandson strengthens her position as much as it changes yours. She's been navigating this institution longer than you have, which means she's watched this process from multiple angles, first as the woman in the room, then as the woman outside it. She doesn't need to say anything. Her presence in the corridor is the statement. Afterward, if everything goes correctly, boy, alive, acknowledged, the waiting doesn't stop. It relocates. Your son will be raised inside the harem under your supervision until the age when the sultan decides otherwise. You raise him inside the walls that you yourself entered as a carrier, probably before you understood what any of this was. He'll learn what you teach him, surrounded by what you've learned to navigate. You teach him the names of the Khalfas by his 2nd year. By his 3rd, he knows not to speak first in a room where an ikbal is present. The documentation is filed. The witnesses disperse. The room is quieter than it was an hour ago. You report your illness the same way you report everything else, through a Khalfa, upward, with the usual lag between the message leaving and someone acting on it. The harem has its own hospital ward, not as charity, but as institutional infrastructure, because a non-functional population is an administrative problem. The ward is staffed, the medicines are stocked, and the treatment you receive reflects your rank the way everything reflects your rank. Getting sick here is partly a medical event and partly a test of how valuable the institution currently considers you. The ward itself is a real room with real beds, which sounds obvious until you remember that most of early modern Europe was treating illness with prayers, bloodletting, and the proximity of saints' bones. The harem hospital has physicians, a pharmacy, and a record-keeping system. It also has a waiting list, and where you fall on that list correlates very precisely with your candle ration. A carrier with a fever reports upward and waits. A haseki with the same fever gets a bed, a blanket, and someone whose entire job is to hold the blanket. Male physicians are permitted in the ward under strict protocol, which is basically the Ottoman version of a hospital's visitor policy, except the policy is enforced by armed eunuchs and has never been posted on a website. The physician asks questions. A Khalfa relays them. You answer. The Khalfa relays back. The physician has, in theory, examined you. Everyone agrees this counts. The diagnosis travels the same route in reverse, arrives slightly altered, and you begin your treatment. Medicines come from palace stores that are, by any practical standard, well stocked. Ottoman pharmacy drew on Arabic, Persian, and Greek traditions simultaneously, which is the equivalent of having access to 3 different medical schools at once, except none of them agree on the underlying theory and all 3 are confident the others are wrong. You receive rosewater, theriac paste, and possibly something derived from mastic resin, which the harem kitchen uses in sweets and the pharmacy uses in poultices, and nobody considers this a conflict. The mastic doesn't either. A ward attendant kneels by the bed and folds a damp cloth along a crease that has been folded in the same place for decades. She places it on the sick woman's forehead. She does not speak. She does not leave. She waits until the cloth has warmed, then replaces it. She will do this for most of the afternoon. This is the entire protocol. Recovery happens in the ward if your rank warrants a bed, or back in your shared chamber if it doesn't. The chamber holds 6 to 10 women on a good day. When one person is sick, the arithmetic changes. The room is not large. The winter smell in a stone corridor is already burning wood, olive oil soap, and layered floral perfume. Add a low fever and a damp compress, and the atmosphere becomes something a scented candle company would call Ottoman restoration and sell at $40 a unit. You recover or you don't, and the institution notes both outcomes. You'd think by now there'd be a better system. There isn't. There's just you, the compress, and 9 roommates trying to sleep through it. Death inside the harem is handled with the same procedural briskness as everything else. The record is updated. The room assignment is redistributed. The fabric allowance is cancelled. A woman who spent a decade moving up through carrier and ikbal can be administratively dissolved in an afternoon. There's no ceremony for the middle ranks. The institution continues at the same pace it kept before, which is steady, unhurried, and entirely indifferent to individual disruption. Senior women die differently. A Valide Sultan's death reshapes the political structure in ways that ripple outward through the entire palace. Her correspondence stops. Her income stops. The petitioners who came to her audience room stop coming. The suite with the Iznik tiles, cobalt blue, tomato red, tulips and cypress trees climbing the walls gets reassigned or sits quiet, waiting for the next woman who makes it that far. Most don't. The tiles don't comment on the turnover. You eat what the kitchen provides, and what the kitchen provides is the output of a procurement operation that never stops running. During Suleiman I's reign, Ottoman treasury records document over 50,000 kilograms of sugar purchased for palace use in a single year. Someone tracked that number by hand in a register. The register survived, historians have read it, and the number is still startling. Your daily meals are the end product of a supply chain that employs hundreds of people, maintains its own hierarchy, and has detailed opinions about how much of everything you specifically deserve. The food hierarchy follows your rank exactly, which shouldn't surprise you at this point. A carrier in a shared dormitory room receives a standard daily portion, adequate, documented, not particularly interesting. A haseki receives more variety, better cuts, additional sweets. The Valide Sultan receives what's essentially a separate meal service, with her own kitchen attendants, her own preferred preparations, and the implicit understanding that the palace cooks know her tastes and have adjusted accordingly. It's basically a Michelin-starred tasting menu, except the restaurant has never had a different customer, and the chef doesn't take requests so much as anticipate them. The harem has its own dedicated coffee attendants, cariyes, whose entire professional identity is organized around the preparation and service of coffee. This is not a casual assignment. Ottoman coffee preparation in the 16th and 17th centuries involves precisely calibrated heat, specific grinding textures, and a service sequence that communicates rank through timing and vessel quality. Your cup arrives in a holder, a zarf, whose material tells the room exactly where you stand. Silver for the upper tiers, copper for everyone below. The coffee itself is the same. The container is the message. An elaborate court meal might include saffron and pistachio rice pilaf, lamb stew with dried fruits, cheese burek, and rosewater honey mastic sweets, which is a little like a Nobu tasting menu, except the courses arrive in order of your social importance and nobody asks if you have dietary restrictions. The sweets arrive last and in quantity, which explains part of where those 50,000 kilograms of sugar per year actually go. The rest goes to preserves, sherbets, pastry dough, and a category the records describe simply as confections, which is doing considerable work as a word. Picture a single ledger line item labelled confections that's quietly burying through the annual GDP of a small European dessert operation. That's the one. A pastry carrier carries a long tray of mastic sweets on one forearm, balanced the way a waiter who has never dropped anything balances the thing they have never dropped. She is not watching the tray. She is watching the three attendants ahead of her. If one stops, she stops. The tray gets where it's going because the line holds. The line has been holding for about 200 years. The hammam, the bathhouse, is its own sensory event and runs on a separate schedule from meals but with the same rank-stratified access. Steam rises carrying the smell of olive oil, soap and ardour, a depilatory paste made from sugar, lemon juice and boiled water reduced to a resin, applied every 2 to 4 weeks, whether you particularly want it or not. Wooden patterns, takunya, clatter on the wet stone floors because the floor is perpetually damp and nobody's figured out a better solution. The clatter echoes. The hammam announces itself before you arrive and long after you've left. In winter, the stone corridors are heated by a hypocaust system, underfloor channels fed by wood-burning furnaces maintained by servants working in the basement levels, which is basically a DoorDash dispatch for kilowatts, except the dispatcher is asleep and the driver is 8 years old. The smell in those corridors in January is burning wood layered under heavy floral perfume layered under olive oil soap, a combination that doesn't exactly conflict but doesn't resolve either. It's just there, filling the space between the Iznik tiles and the sound of fountain water running through decorative channels that were never designed to be turned off. The sensory texture of the harem is not what the European painters imagined. Ingres's 1862 painting, Lebain Turk, depicts a circular room of intertwined naked women, soft-lit and languid, which has no relationship to a building that smells like wood smoke and depilatory paste, and has 400 rooms and a functioning hospital ward. The fantasy requires stillness. The actual building never stops. You add more layers in winter, because the stone corridors don't care about rank. They're cold for everyone. Heat in the harem comes from braziers and underfloor systems in specific sections of the building, and access to the warm sections correlates, as access to everything correlates here, with rank. Women with private apartments have better heating. Dormitory women manage with what the shared supply provides. You apply heavier perfume to your hair and clothing in winter than in summer, because cold concentrates, smells, and the smell of a shared dormitory in January is a collective problem that everyone is managing, and nobody is officially acknowledging. The underfloor heating, the hypercourse system, which is Roman in origin and very much alive in Ottoman practice, runs beneath the better rooms. Somewhere below you, a servant is feeding wood into a furnace in the basement. You don't see this person. You benefit from this person, or you don't. Your corner of the chamber has been cold in January for 3 winters in a row, which is basically a Costco membership tier in reverse, except the renewal notice is the draft you feel around your ankle at 4 in the morning. The Valide Sultan suite has Iznik tile on the walls, cobalt blues and tomato reds, tulips and cypress trees, the finest ceramic work in the empire, and a private bath, and a floor that's actually warm in February. You know this because you've been in the corridor outside it. The corridor outside it is also warmer than the corridor you came from. You put your palm against the wall on your way back and feel the heat bleeding through the plaster 2 rooms in before it stops. A kitchen carrier returns from the storeroom with an armful of split wood, breath visible ahead of her. She disappears through the basement door. 10 minutes later, nothing has visibly happened. An hour later, a different corridor has gotten slightly warmer. You will never know which corridor was hers. Your dormitory chamber holds 6 to 10 women depending on the season and the current resident population, and in winter everyone's extra blanket becomes a minor diplomatic object. Picture a UN climate summit where the treaty is who gets the corner furthest from the window. The window lets in cold. The brazier in the corner manages, which is to say it doesn't not manage, which is to say the room is survivable in a way that requires some personal commitment. You sleep in heavier clothing than you wore in October. The clothing has opinions about movement. In the corridors between sections, the smell in January is burning wood from the furnaces, olive oil soap drifting from the hammam, and the heavy floral perfume that everyone in the building applies in quantities that scale with the ambient temperature. It's not unpleasant. It's not pleasant. It's 3 distinct smells occupying the same cold air at the same time, which is basically the olfactory equivalent of a committee. What doesn't change between seasons is the sound. The fountain channels run year-round, water moving through decorative channels built into the courtyard walls, which produces a sound that is continuous and ambient and doesn't pause for winter. Quran recitation from the lessons rooms, music from somewhere down the corridor, strings and a voice, stopping and starting. Kitchen smells arriving from a direction that doesn't correspond to where you think the kitchen is. The building has its own acoustic logic and you've mostly stopped trying to map it. Someone in a higher rank has a room that's quiet and warm and faces a courtyard with a fountain. You pass her door on the way to the evening meal, and the light leaking through the gap at the bottom is steadier than yours. Her candle is new. Yours is 3/4 gone. You note this, because noting things is what you do now, and you keep walking. You've watched enough transitions of power to understand what happens when one Valide Sultan's position becomes another woman's ambition. Hürrem Sultan served as Valide Sultan from 1623, acted as regent for 2 successive sultans, and was one of the most consequential political figures of the century. In 1651, servants loyal to her rival Turhan Sultan, mother of the reigning Mehmed IV, entered her bedroom at night and strangled her with a curtain cord or suffocated her with a pillow, depending on which source you consult. Both sources agree on the outcome. Hürrem had navigated 30 years of crises. She didn't navigate this one. Hürrem's reign as effective power holder had run longer than most grand viziers managed to stay alive. She'd steered the empire through the reigns of Murad IV and Ibrahim I, Ibrahim being the man who'd spent 22 years in the Cafes before ruling and emerged, by most accounts, not entirely reassembled. She managed him. She managed his successor. She was, in the language of the Imperial Council, indispensable, which is the kind of status that works right up until someone younger decides it doesn't. Turhan Sultan was 25. Hürrem was somewhere in her 60s, the precise year of her birth being one of those details the Ottoman record-keeping system considered optional. The rivalry between them was the kind of thing that gets described in diplomatic dispatches as a disagreement over regency arrangements, which is basically the 17th century equivalent of an HOA board dispute, that gets resolved not through the posted bylaws but through the board president's adult children showing up at your door at 2 in the morning. The bedroom where it happened was not a modest room. Valide Sultan quarters included Iznik tile work, a private hammam, and an audience chamber for receiving petitioners. The curtain cord in question would have been part of the same heavy textile environment, brocade hangings, wool divans, layered silk cushions, that made the suite the most materially comfortable space in the compound. You'd think by now the building would have installed locks. It hadn't. The room didn't protect her. It was just well decorated while it didn't. A Kalfa on the outer corridor hears a door opening that is not her door, at an hour when no door should be opening. She does not move. She does not look out. She folds the edge of the cloth she is holding once, then again, and waits for the sound to finish. She will be asked, later, whether she heard anything. She will say no. What followed was fast. Hürrem Sultan assumed the position of Valide Sultan. The Imperial Council registered the transition. By the following morning, the Kalfas were carrying new room assignment slips to 4 ikbal and 2 haseki whose positions had been contingent on Kuzum's patronage. The coffee service arrived at the Valide Sultan's apartment on schedule. Same zarf, same attendant, different woman in the chair. Kuzum's body was buried at the new mosque in Istanbul in a tomb she'd commissioned herself. She'd planned for a lot of contingencies. The tomb was the one that stuck. The European diplomatic community received the news and processed it through the available frameworks, which were not good frameworks. Ambassadors filed reports describing palace intrigue, oriental despotism, and the dangerous passions of harem women. Hürrem Sultan went on to become a significant political actor in her own right, commissioning the new mosque's completion and maintaining diplomatic correspondence with foreign powers. She was effective. She was also the person who'd ordered the curtain cord. You see her cross the second courtyard a week after the funeral. Her attendants trail at the correct distance. The new Valide Sultan's coffee service arrives at the expected hour. Hürrem Sultan's political career had spanned 4 decades inside a system that gave women no formal title, no official portfolio, and no line in the imperial constitution, and she'd run the empire anyway. The old Kalfa, who had served her longest, retires to the outer compound within the year. You pass her once at morning coffee. She drinks slowly. She doesn't look up. You exist inside a set of assumptions you didn't create. The European ambassadors beyond these walls have constructed a very specific image of what's happening in here, and the image has almost no relationship to documented reality. The harem of European diplomatic dispatches is a scene of erotic captivity, women arranged for availability, languishing in perfumed idleness, without agency or intelligence. The ambassadors write these dispatches and then cross the first courtyard on foot to hand-deliver letters to a woman they have just finished describing as a passive ornament. The letters are dense with trade terms, the dispatches are not. Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres painted his version in 1862. Le Bain Turc depicts a round room full of intertwined naked women, soft-lit, arranged like a fever dream someone had after reading one too many diplomatic dispatches and not enough Ottoman primary sources. The painting is technically accomplished. It is also entirely invented. No round room, no arrangement. Ingres had never been inside Topkapı. He'd never been inside any Ottoman palace. He was 78 years old and working from imagination, which is basically the 1862 equivalent of a Wikipedia article written by someone who'd only read the talk page. The pattern runs deeper than one painter. European accounts of the harem circulate through ambassadors, travel writers, and theologians, most of whom hadn't crossed the threshold, and the few who weren't permitted past the public reception rooms. Picture a restaurant reviewer writing a 1,000-word profile from the parking lot. That's the genre. You watch an English traveller in 1693 take notes in the public audience hall while facing the opposite direction from the corridor, where anything interesting is currently happening. He leaves after an hour. The book he publishes in London 3 years later describes the harem in considerable detail. The harem is on the other side of a wall he never saw. Nurbanu Sultan maintained sustained contact with Venetian diplomatic agents through the 1570s. The Venetians cultivated her deliberately, because Ottoman-Venetian relations ran partly through her office, and she knew it, and they knew she knew it. Her conversation wasn't small talk. It was statecraft delivered through intermediaries, and it moved policy. The fantasy version of the harem doesn't have a Nurbanu. It has odalisques who don't speak the language of the people writing about them. The actual version does have a Nurbanu, which is why Venetian dispatches mention her by name and track her movements. Safiye Sultan went further. Between 1595 and 1603, while serving as Valide Sultan, She exchanged letters and gifts with Queen Elizabeth I of England on the subject of trade and political alignment. Those letters are in the British Museum. They're not love letters or ceremonial pleasantries. They're diplomatic correspondence between two senior figures managing a shared interest in not being dominated by Spain. Two women, different empires, coordinating. The ambassadors who insisted the harem was a place of passive captivity were, during this same period, carrying the letters. A junior eunuch escorts the English traveller back through the first courtyard. Neither speaks. The Englishman walks out into the street and begins composing, in his head, the sentences he will use in London to describe what he has not seen. The eunuch recrosses the courtyard and hands a sealed letter to a senior caliph at the inner gate. The letter is going to England. It will arrive before the Englishman's book does. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu arrived in 1717 with her husband, the British ambassador, and she did something the male observers hadn't managed. She went inside. She visited Ottoman women's spaces, bathed with them, talked with them, and then wrote about what she actually saw. Her Turkish embassy letters, published in 1763, explicitly dismantled the captivity narrative. She observed that Ottoman women of rank had legal property rights, financial independence, and considerable freedom of movement, more, she noted with some edge, than English women of equivalent station. Nobody in London particularly wanted to hear this. The book was published anyway. Montagu also noticed the Ottoman practice of variolation, deliberate smallpox inoculation, already standard among the women around her, and brought the technique back to England. The harem, the place Europeans imagined as a site of idle, perfumed ignorance, had better public health infrastructure than most of Europe. Ingres was not consulted on the matter. Ingres had at that point been born, but not consulted. You hear about Lady Mary Wortley Montagu from a caliph who showed her the bath in Adern. The caliph is specific about the corset. In 1717, Montagu had arrived in Constantinople as the wife of the British ambassador, and unlike every European male observer before her, she was allowed into spaces where Ottoman women actually lived. She went. She wrote it down. Her Turkish embassy letters, published in 1763, contradicted the standard European account at every major point. Women who weren't imprisoned, weren't idle, and had a social and material world nobody outside had bothered to accurately describe. Montagu visited the hammam in Adern and wrote about it in detail that scandalized people back home, which tells you more about people back home than it does about the hammam. She described women relaxing, socializing, having their hair dressed, and conducting what she identified as a functioning social institution, not a scene of degradation or captivity. The women she observed weren't alarmed by her presence. Several were curious about her. One reportedly examined her corset with undisguised pity, which, given that the corset in question was compressing Montagu's ribcage into the shape of a wine bottle, seems like a fair response. A caliph at the Adern bath lifts one end of Montagu's corset between thumb and forefinger, then lets it drop. She does not say anything. The other women nearby pause their conversations just long enough to watch the drop, then resume. The drop was the whole commentary. Montagu is the only person in the room who did not know what was being said. What she didn't do was dress up the experience. Montagu's letters read less like travel writing and more like field notes, which is basically what they were. She named what she saw. She described the rooms, the clothing, the social rankings, the visiting protocols. She understood she was looking at a hierarchy, not a prison, and she said so in plain language, which put her considerably ahead of, for instance, every European painter who'd spent the previous century imagining the place from a hotel in Paris. Montagu also came home with something more consequential than descriptions. Ottoman variolation, the practice of deliberately introducing a small amount of smallpox material to produce immunity, was standard procedure in Istanbul by the time she arrived. She had her own son inoculated in 1718. She then spent years trying to convince the English medical establishment that this was a good idea, which is basically the experience of emailing your findings to a committee that hasn't opened the attachment. The English medical establishment was sceptical. The English medical establishment was also dying of smallpox at a rate that Montagu found difficult to justify. Have you ever tried to convince a roomful of experts that the thing they've been dismissing for a decade is the thing that works? She did, for years. Her advocacy contributed, eventually, to the broader acceptance of inoculation that preceded Edward Jenner's vaccine by decades. Her letters survive in full. They're specific, observant, and occasionally very funny. She noted that Ottoman women of means were, in her assessment, freer in several practical respects than their English counterparts. They controlled property, they moved through social spaces, and they weren't legally absorbed into their husbands' identities upon marriage. She didn't romanticize this. She also didn't pretend the slave origins of harem women were acceptable. She was working with the analytical tools of 1717, which weren't perfect, but she used them more carefully than almost anyone else who'd written on the subject. The Turkish embassy letters weren't widely read until after her death. She hadn't published them herself. The manuscripts circulated privately, and a version appeared in print in 1763, 20 years after she died. By that point, Ingres was still decades away from painting his famous round room full of implausible arrangements. You sit in the real bath, which is rectangular, in the afternoon slot your rank permits, while somewhere in London a bookseller is filing the letters on a lower shelf than the Orientalist engravings. The engravings sell faster. The Kalfa pouring your rinse water doesn't know any of this. She wouldn't be surprised to hear it. You've spent your entire adult life inside palace walls, and in 1924, the Republic of Turkey sends an eviction notice. The legislation dismantling the Ottoman Sultanate's last institutional remnants has a logistical consequence. The women still residing at Dolmabahce Palace need to leave. Some of them entered as girls. Some have never been outside. The palace is being converted into a museum, which is, in the long run, one of the more useful things a building can become. And the women who were the institution's last residents are being redirected into a city that has a different name, a different government, and no particular plan for them. Dolmabahce is not Topkapı. By 1924, the harem's centre of gravity had shifted to this newer, more European-looking palace on the Bosphorus, all neoclassical columns and crystal chandeliers, which is basically the Ottoman Empire's attempt to look like a Versailles lobby renovation and convince everyone things were fine. Things were not fine. The Sultanate had been abolished in 1922. The Caliphate followed in 1924. The last formal stipend payment arrives on a Tuesday in a cloth pouch that weighs noticeably less than the previous month's. Nobody in the building has anywhere to complain. The women being evicted in 1924 aren't the haseki or the Valide Sultan. Those ranks are historical. The women still in residence are the survivors, the elderly, the ones with nowhere to return to, the ones who'd arrived as children from the Caucasus or the Balkans and had no family address on file. Some had spent 60 years inside palace compounds. The outside city, which is now called Istanbul and is in the middle of becoming a secular republic, doesn't have a formal intake structure for them. There's no official process. The document ordering the eviction is very clear about the date. It's considerably less clear about what happens next. An elderly Kalfa folds a single wool shawl along a crease that has been the same crease for 40 years. She sets it in the small wooden case at the foot of her cot, closes the case, rests one hand on the lid, and does not move. She is not packing. She has finished packing. She is sitting with her own hand on the case. Some women are given pensions, small ones, the kind that acknowledges an obligation without fully meeting it. Some are placed with families. Some are simply released into a city that's reorganizing itself at speed and doesn't have the bandwidth to worry about the institutional remnants of a harem that European painters had already decided was a fantasy pool scene. The French government, to its credit, does not send Ingres to document the departure. You carry out with you a wooden hair comb, 3 silver coins from your last stipend, a folded letter you never sent, and a skill set the city outside cannot use. Ottoman court etiquette, classical music, embroidery, the precise hierarchy of a system that no longer exists. You stand at the gate. A tram clatters past on the boulevard. You have not seen a tram before. Imagine spending your entire life inside one building and stepping out into a city that has decided, in your absence, to reinvent the concept of public transportation. The city outside doesn't need a carrier. It needs someone who can navigate a streetcar. Topkapı itself had already been emptied and handed to the Ministry of Education in 1924. It opened as a museum in 1924, which means the institution and its archive became publicly visible in the same year its last residents were asked to leave the premises. The Muhimi Defterleri, the Imperial Council registers that Leslie Peirce would eventually use to document Valide Sultan authority and official decrees, went into the archive. The women went into the city. The records, at least, got a building. And so here we are, at the end of a very long day inside Topkapı Palace. You entered a building with 400 rooms, You learned a hierarchy that made org charts look casual. You attended a music lesson, sat through a Quran recitation, drank coffee prepared by someone whose entire job title was coffee, and navigated a bureaucracy that had opinions about how many candles you were allowed to own. You corresponded, possibly, with Queen Elizabeth I. You did not, at any point, recline in a circular pool of intertwined women while someone played the lute. That was a painting. That was one man's painting. He had never been inside. The women who lived here were educated, ranked, and politically aware, operating inside a system that was genuinely coercive and genuinely real. Most of them hadn't chosen to be there. Some of them ran it anyway. That deserves a moment. And then there were the others, the eunuchs who paid an extraordinary price for proximity to power, the lower-ranking women sleeping six to a room in cold stone dormitories, the cariyes who poured coffee for rooms they couldn't sit in, the princes sealed in a suite with no windows to the world. The official record mostly doesn't say their names. Let your shoulders drop, settle back into your pillow and let the palace go. Sleep well.